Hey there, welcome to Outlaw Icons, where history whispers in the dark. Tonight, we're stepping into the world of Don Vito Genovese. Some called him the boss of all bosses. Others whispered his name with fear, like a curse in the streets of Little Italy. He rose from the crowded alleys of Naples to the very throne of the American Mafia, a man who played both sides of the ocean, brushed shoulders with dictators, and turned the mob into a global empire of blood and narcotics. But power always comes with a price. And for Vito, it ended in betrayal, prison, and death. Before we dive in, drop a comment and tell me, where are you tuning in from right now? It blows my mind seeing this little underworld of ours stretch across cities, countries, and time zones. And hey, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell too. You don't want to miss what's coming next. So settle in, let the noise of the day fade out, and follow me into the shadows. This is Outlaw Icons, your sleepy dawn. Chapter 1, Born in Naples. The story of Don Vito Genovese does not begin in the dark alleys of New York, but in a cramped stone house on the southern coast of Italy. Luchiano, near Naples, was not a city of wealth or opportunity in the late 19th century. It was a place where the air smelled of salt and sweat, where children grew up watching men fight over scraps of bread and women prayed for their husbands to come home from the sea. It was in this unforgiving soil, in the year 1897, that Vito was born. And from the moment he took his first breath, the world around him taught him a brutal lesson. Survival was not a right. It was a privilege earned through cunning and strength. Imagine a narrow street in Naples, echoing with the shouts of vendors, the cries of hungry children, and the sharp whispers of men whose eyes gave away more than their mouths ever dared to say. The Camorra, the Neapolitan brotherhood that thrived in shadows, was not an abstract idea. It was the unspoken law of the neighborhood. It shaped who lived, who starved, and who disappeared. To a child like Vito, it was as ordinary as church bells in the morning. Men in worn suits with thick mustaches were both feared and respected. They collected debts, broke bones, and held power the way priests held rosaries. Vito's father was not a rich man. He labored, sometimes at the docks, sometimes in fields, always chasing coins that never seemed to stretch far enough. His hands were rough and scarred, and his back carried the weight of generations of poverty. His mother, hardened by endless days of keeping the family fed on scraps, guarded the household with a sharp tongue and tired eyes. In their home, there was no romance about struggle. It was the air they breathed, the daily fight to keep children alive through hunger and sickness. Vito grew up watching their exhaustion, but instead of breaking under it, something in him hardened. He was not going to be another man swallowed by the poverty of Naples. The streets became his classroom. There, he learned that silence could be more powerful than words, and that violence, quick, sharp, and decisive, could speak louder than the prayers his mother whispered at night. Older boys taught him tricks: how to snatch a coin without being caught, how to slip through a crowd like smoke, how to look someone in the eyes just long enough to unsettle them. By the time he was 10, Vito was no stranger to confrontation. His fists flew faster than most boys his age, and though he was not tall, he had a presence, an intensity, that made others hesitate before crossing him. The Camorra men noticed him, not because he was special yet, but because he had something rare. He did not flinch. Fear seemed to roll off him like rain on stone. In a world where hesitation could mean death, this was a valuable trait. They gave him small tasks: carry this, deliver that, keep watch here. For Vito, these were not just errands. They were invitations to something greater, glimpses into a world where respect was taken, not begged for. Life in Luchiano was a paradox. On one side, there was the beauty of the sea, glittering under the sun, and the old traditions of family and faith. On the other, there was the suffocating grip of corruption and violence. A boy could go from kneeling at Mass in the morning to carrying a knife in his pocket by nightfall. Vito grew up walking that tightrope, balancing innocence with an early awareness that the rules preached by priests were not the same rules enforced in the streets. Neighbors whispered stories about boys who rose in the Camorra, Some became local kings, eating well while others starved. Others ended up in shallow graves outside town, their names spoken only in hushed tones. Young Vito absorbed every tale, every warning. But inside him burned something that made warnings sound less like caution and more like challenges. If the world was rigged, he thought, then only a fool would play fair. The turn of the century did not bring relief to Naples. Italy itself was fractured, poor in the south, wealthier in the north, and families like the Genovese carried that fracture in their daily lives. Work was scarce, hunger constant, and the shadow of migration loomed over every conversation. America was a distant rumor, a place where coins fell from the sky, where men who left with nothing could come back wearing suits and gold watches. For boys like Vito, the dream of New York grew larger with every story told in dimly lit taverns by men who had once crossed the ocean. But before that journey, there were years of sharpening. The Camorra was not just about crime. It was about discipline, hierarchy, and loyalty twisted into something ruthless. Vito observed how men paid tribute to those above them, how disputes were settled not with words, but with knives. He watched as debts were enforced with broken bones, as shopkeepers lowered their eyes in fear when certain men passed by. To outsiders, it might have looked like chaos. To Vito, it was order. Brutal, yes, but consistent in a way poverty never was. By adolescence, he had grown into a wiry, sharp-eyed teenager with a chip on his shoulder and ambition far too big for the narrow streets of Naples. He had learned the unwritten rules of power. Never show weakness, strike before being struck, and always, always, know who you owe and who owes you. It was not schoolbook knowledge. It was survival knowledge. And in Vito's mind, survival was not enough. He wanted more. At night, he would lie awake listening to the arguments of his parents over money, the groans of neighbors through thin walls, the distant laughter of men who never seemed to worry about their next meal. He studied the gap between those who scraped by and those who held power. Somewhere deep inside, a vow formed. He would never be one of the desperate men begging. He would be the one others begged to. By the early 1900s, his family, like thousands of others, faced a choice. Stay in Italy and accept the slow suffocation of poverty, or risk everything on the promise of America. Letters from across the ocean painted pictures of opportunity, of streets buzzing with energy, of jobs, even if dirty and dangerous, that paid more than most could ever dream of in Naples. For Vito's parents, it was not a matter of ambition but of survival. For Vito, it was destiny. Still, leaving Italy was not a simple decision. It meant tearing roots from soil, abandoning the known, even if bitter, for the unknown, even if it sparkled with promise. His mother wept as she packed what little they owned. His father hid his own fears behind silence, the way men often do when they feel powerless but cannot admit it. And Vito, he felt something else. Excitement. America was not just a chance at a better life. It was a stage big enough for the ambitions already burning in his chest. But before departure, Naples gave him one last lesson. One evening, he witnessed a beating in the street, a debt collector thrashing a man who had failed to pay what he owed. The crowd gathered, but no one intervened. People averted their eyes, muttering prayers, while the man bled into the dirt. Vito watched, and he understood. Respect was not given to those who followed rules. It was demanded by those who broke them. That night, the thought hardened into certainty. He was not leaving Naples to escape its lessons. He was leaving to use them. The year 1913 marked the crossing. The Genovese family boarded a ship bound for New York, packed shoulder to shoulder with hundreds of other desperate souls. The Atlantic stretched like an endless graveyard of waves, swallowing days into weeks. Seasickness, hunger, and fear were constant companions. Yet through it all, Vito stood at the deck, staring into the horizon with eyes that did not blink. He was 16 years old, but already something colder lived behind his gaze. He was not just a boy chasing opportunity. He was a predator sensing new hunting grounds. On that ship, families prayed for health, for survival, for a slice of the American dream. Vito prayed for nothing. He calculated. He watched how people scrambled for scraps, how fear twisted their bodies, how hope kept them moving forward even when logic told them to quit. To him, the voyage was a mirror of life itself, a brutal test, where the strong carved paths and the weak followed behind. The day the Statue of Liberty appeared through the fog, a murmur rippled across the ship. Tears streamed down faces worn by hunger and exhaustion. For most, it was a symbol of freedom. For Vito, it was a challenge. That towering figure with its torch did not represent welcome. It represented power. And power, he thought, was there for the taking. America awaited. New York, with its bustling streets, its towers clawing at the sky, its neighborhoods buzzing with languages from every corner of the earth. A city alive, dangerous, and restless. But before Vito could carve his name into its underworld, he had to survive the tests waiting at Ellis Island. Officials with sharp eyes, doctors checking for disease, bureaucrats flipping through endless ledgers. Many families were turned back, their dreams shattered at the threshold. The Genovese stood in line with pounding hearts, praying silently that fate would not spit them back into Naples' hunger. They made it through. Papers stamped, names logged, the family stepped into a new world. But the dream that others celebrated felt different for Vito. He looked at New York not as a refuge, but as a battlefield. And like every battlefield, there were rules, unwritten, brutal, and unforgiving. In those first moments on American soil, he did not yet know the names of the men he would meet, the wars he would fight, or the empire he would one day command. But already, the seed had been planted. The poverty of Naples had taught him hunger. The Camorra had taught him violence. And now New York would give him the stage to use both. What no one could see, not his parents, not the officials at Ellis Island, not even Vito himself, was how far that hunger would take him and how much blood it would cost. The boy stepping off the boat was just 16, but the man he would become would make the world tremble. And in the shadows of New York, the whispers were already waiting. Chapter 2: The Immigrant. The boy stepped off the boat in New York with nothing but a threadbare coat and eyes too sharp for 16 years. His shoes were worn, his hands already rough, and his family's hopes clung to him like a shadow. It was the year 1913, and Ellis Island was the final gate. Some families passed through with tears of relief. Others were turned away, broken by a single doctor's decision. For the Genovese family, every heartbeat felt like a gamble. If an official saw sickness in their faces or poverty too deep in their eyes, they would be sent back across the ocean. But the papers were stamped, the names logged, and just like that, they were allowed in. It felt less like a welcome and more like a challenge, as though the city itself was saying, "You made it past the door. Now prove you deserve to stay." The Genovese settled in Little Italy, a neighborhood that was both sanctuary and trap. On Mulberry Street, Italian voices filled the air, the smell of garlic and frying oil spilled out from crowded kitchens, and laundry hung like flags of survival between buildings. To newcomers, it felt like home, safe, familiar. But underneath the laughter of children and the bustle of shopkeepers was another rhythm. The rhythm of power. Men with fedoras tilted low, walking like they owned the ground beneath them. Deals whispered in alleys. Debts collected with fists. In Little Italy, respect wasn't earned with kindness. It was bought in blood and fear. For the Genovese, life was better than Naples, but only just. Vito's father worked long hours for little pay, breaking his body to keep food on the table. His mother stretched every coin, bargaining at markets with the desperation of a woman who knew hunger too well. But young Vito saw something different. He saw men who lived better than his parents. Men who wore tailored suits while others patched their clothes. Men who smoked fine cigars while fathers like his coughed up dust from factory floors. And these men weren't politicians or priests. They were gangsters. One night, walking home from an errand, Vito saw it up close. A shopkeeper, trembling, handed over a thick envelope to two men outside his store. They didn't shout. They didn't threaten. They simply stood there, silent and expectant. The shopkeeper's hands shook as he passed over the envelope, eyes on the ground, too ashamed to look up. Vito understood without being told. This was protection money. In Little Italy, it was as common as paying rent. But in his young mind, the lesson was sharper than any schoolbook. Fear was currency. Control was business. And these men held more power in a few seconds than his father would hold in a lifetime of labor. School never held Vito's interest. Words on chalkboards felt meaningless compared to the lessons he picked up in the streets. He saw how older boys ran errands for local toughs, delivering messages, carrying packages, sometimes standing lookout when something illegal was happening. To Vito, these weren't crimes. They were opportunities, a chance to stand closer to the men who commanded respect. The more he watched, the more he wanted in. Little Italy in the 1910s was a place where poverty and ambition collided. Families prayed in church on Sunday, then turned a blind eye when gangsters strutted into restaurants on Monday. Everyone knew who they were. Everyone pretended not to. To survive in this world, you had to learn to play both sides, show respect to the law on the surface while quietly acknowledging the real power in the shadows. Vito absorbed this duality like it was second nature. His first brushes with the underworld were small, running errands for older boys who had ties to local crews, delivering envelopes he never opened, watching doors while men conducted business inside. Sometimes he was paid in coins, sometimes just in a nod of approval. But each task was a step, a test, and Vito passed them all. He was quick, reliable, and most importantly, unafraid. Fear was the invisible leash around most boys his age. They worried about getting caught, about angering the wrong men, about the consequences of disobedience. Vito did not. If anything, he seemed to feed on the danger, like a fire that burned hotter the closer it came to being snuffed out. Men noticed. In neighborhoods like Little Italy, the underworld was always searching for new blood, and a boy who didn't flinch was worth more than one who prayed too much. But the immigrant life wasn't all shadowy lessons. It was crowded apartments where families of 6 shared 2 rooms. It was the stink of garbage piled high in alleys, the constant hum of rats scurrying in walls, the sickness that spread faster than the doctors could treat. Many immigrant children died before reaching adulthood. But Vito survived. Survival became his identity, his badge of honor. He didn't just endure hardship. He wore it like armor. His parents tried to pull him toward the straight path. His father preached hard work, the dignity of honest labor. His mother clung to the church, lighting candles for her children's safety. But even as a teenager, Vito could see through their illusions. Hard work left his father exhausted and penniless. Faith left his mother hopeful but powerless. Meanwhile, the gangsters down the block grew richer and stronger with every passing year. Vito loved his parents, but he could not love their weakness. There was a saying in the neighborhood, "America is a place where the streets are paved with gold. But first, you have to learn who owns the pavement." For most immigrants, that meant finding a factory job or opening a small shop or sewing clothes in a dim workshop for pennies. For Vito, it meant something else. He wanted to own the pavement itself. The turning point came in a back alley. 2 older boys dragged a man into the shadows and beat him until he cried out for mercy. They accused him of cheating at cards, of not paying what he owed. Vito watched from a corner, his young face hidden, his eyes fixed on every blow. When the man collapsed, coughing blood, one of the boys caught Vito watching. Instead of chasing him away, he beckoned him closer. He handed Vito a small knife, its handle worn smooth from use. Next time, the boy said, "You'll finish it." It was not just a dare. It was an initiation. In that moment, Vito felt something cold settle inside him. Not fear, not hesitation, but a grim acceptance. Violence was not just survival in Little Italy. It was a language, and he was learning to speak it fluently. Still, the streets were not without risk. Police raids swept through tenements, cracking down on bootleggers, gamblers, and loan sharks. Sometimes innocent men were dragged into patrol wagons just to fill quotas. Immigrants learned quickly that justice did not always belong to the poor. For Vito, this reality only reinforced what Naples had already taught him. The law was not there to protect him. It was there to control him. The real safety, the real freedom, lay in power outside the law. By his late teens, Vito was straddling 2 worlds. At home, he was the dutiful son, quiet and respectful, eating bread his mother stretched from nothing, listening to his father's weary talk about work. But in the streets, he was already something else. Sharp-eyed, ambitious, known by name in corners where men whispered plans and settled scores. His reputation was small, but growing. He was reliable, fearless, and most importantly, useful. Every immigrant family dreamed of success in America. For some, that meant saving enough to buy a home. For others, it meant sending their children to school, hoping they would rise higher than their parents ever could. For Vito, the dream was different. He did not want to escape the shadows. He wanted to master them. The streets of Little Italy were alive with opportunity. Bootlegging would soon explode with the arrival of Prohibition. Gambling dens thrived behind locked doors. Loan sharks preyed on desperate immigrants. And above it all, the early Mafia families fought quietly for control. Vito was still just a boy on the edges of this world. But already, he was leaning in. Already, he was choosing sides. Every night, as he lay on a thin mattress in a crowded room, listening to the snores of his siblings and the quiet sighs of his parents, Vito dreamed not of escape, but of conquest. He imagined himself one day walking the streets not as a poor immigrant boy, but as a man others feared to cross. In his mind, America was not the land of opportunity. It was the land of power. And power, he believed, was waiting for him to claim. What he could not yet know was how close that power already was. How the men he watched in awe from the corners of Little Italy would soon become his partners, his rivals, his enemies. How his first steps into crime were not accidents, but the beginning of a march toward becoming one of the most feared figures in American underworld history. The boy who stepped off the boat in 1913 had survived Naples. He had survived Ellis Island. He had survived the poverty of Little Italy. But survival was not enough anymore. He wanted more. And in the shadows of New York, the underworld was ready to give it to him, at a price. The next test was coming. And Vito, restless and hungry, was ready to take it. Chapter 3, Streets of Little Italy. The first time Vito Genovese was told to hurt someone. The night air in Little Italy was sharp with the smell of roasted chestnuts and cigar smoke. Crowds filled the sidewalks. Children ran between carts. And yet in a narrow alley, hidden from the laughter of families, a boy was about to prove what kind of man he would become. He was not even 20, but already the older men in the neighborhood had noticed him. He walked with a cold stillness, a face that didn't flinch, eyes that held a kind of promise, danger wrapped in silence. The job was simple. A man owed money. He had been warned, then warned again. Words had failed. Now fists would speak. That night, Vito stood in the shadows as two older gangsters dragged the debtor forward. The man begged, his hands trembling, his voice cracking with desperation. He swore he would pay, swore he just needed more time. But in Little Italy, time was not something you were given. It was something you had to take. They handed Vito a lead pipe, its weight heavy in his hands, colder than the November air. For a second, he hesitated, not because of pity, but because he understood. This was no longer child's play. This was the moment that separated errand boys from men of respect. He swung once. Hard. The man crumpled. Silence fell heavier than the blow itself. And when the older gangsters nodded approval, Vito knew he had crossed a line there was no coming back from. From that moment, his reputation began to spread. Little Italy was full of tough kids, but most broke under pressure. Most cracked when real violence demanded not just anger, but commitment. Vito was different. He carried out orders with precision. No wasted motion, no shouting, no chaos. He was like a blade, silent until it cut, sharp enough to leave scars. The streets in those days were carved up like a map no one dared to publish. Gambling dens hidden behind butcher shops. Speakeasies tucked beneath bakeries. Dice games in smoky backrooms. Every corner had its owner, every racket its tax. And behind it all, larger forces moved. The families, the bosses, the men whose names were spoken only in whispers. Young Vito operated at the bottom rung, but already he was looking up. The immigrants of Little Italy carried their old world habits across the ocean. Honor and shame mattered more than law and order. Respect wasn't about shaking hands politely. It was about who people feared enough not to cross. To Vito, violence wasn't just punishment. It was advertisement. Every broken nose, every shattered rib, every man left groaning in the street sent a message louder than words. Cross us, and this is what happens. In this underworld economy, Vito became valuable. He didn't just fight, he enforced. When debts weren't paid, he collected. When gamblers cheated, he corrected. When rivals threatened, he silenced them. And he did it all without hesitation. The older men began to trust him with more, and trust in that world was the real currency. At home, his parents still clung to the dream of America. His father labored in warehouses. His mother kept the family fed. They hoped their son would rise through honest work. But every coin Vito brought home that didn't match his supposed job at the docks was explained away with silence. His mother suspected, his father feared, but neither confronted him. In immigrant families, survival mattered more than truth. If their son was putting food on the table, questions could wait. Vito began dressing sharper, walking taller. He had a knack for carrying himself like he was untouchable, even when he was still just a soldier on the street. That confidence, dangerous as it was, made him stand out. The neighborhood kids who once teased him now looked up to him. Shopkeepers who once ignored him now watched nervously as he passed. Respect was growing, and with it, ambition. But ambition in Little Italy was a double-edged knife. To rise, you had to be willing to fall on it. Violence was not a hobby, it was a language. And Vito was becoming fluent. One story that drifted through the neighborhood told of him walking into a gambling den where a man had refused to pay his debt. The man had friends, big ones, who swore they'd protect him. Vito walked in alone. Minutes later, he walked out with blood on his shirt and silence trailing behind him. No one challenged him after that. The underworld was watching. Names that mattered, Masseria, Luchiano, men building empires from shadows, kept an eye on soldiers like Vito. They needed enforcers, men willing to get their hands dirty without hesitation. The Mafia in America was still young, still shaping itself from scattered gangs into a machine. Men like Vito were the gears that made it turn. Yet, for all his coldness, there was something deeply human in his drive. He had seen his parents suffer, had grown up hungry, had watched neighbors crawl through life begging for scraps. To him, poverty was worse than prison. Power was the only escape. Every punch he threw, every man he put down, felt like revenge against the world that once made him small. Little Italy itself fed this hunger. Walk a block and you'd see the contradictions. Children playing stickball in the street while, 2 doors down, men plotted murders over plates of pasta. Priests blessing families on Sunday morning while gangsters collected their cut on Sunday night. It was a world where morality bent under the weight of necessity. And Vito, sharp enough to see it, leaned into the contradictions rather than resisting them. The police were not blind to the growing violence. Raids hit gambling dens, bootlegging operations, and street corners. But corruption ran deep. A bribe here, a favor there, and charges melted away like snow in spring. For young Vito, this was another lesson. The law was just another racket. And like any racket, it could be bought, broken, or bent to his will. By his early 20s, Vito was no longer just an errand boy. He was feared. His fists, his knife, his cold stare, all tools that made him indispensable to the men above him. He had not yet reached the throne, but he was climbing fast. Each job completed, each order carried out, carved his name deeper into the stone of New York's underworld. Still, every rise carries risk. Rival gangs prowled the edges of Little Italy, hungry for territory, eager to test the mettle of anyone who stood in their way. One night, a fight broke out on a darkened street between rival crews. Blades flashed, bottles shattered, shouts turned into screams. Vito was there, moving through the chaos with calculated precision, striking not wildly but decisively. When the dust cleared, his side stood tall. The message spread quickly. Vito was not just another soldier. He was a fighter who could lead. But leadership came with attention. And in the world of organized crime, attention could be fatal. Older bosses began to take notice. Some saw potential. Others saw threat. In a world where loyalty and betrayal lived side by side, a young man rising too fast was as dangerous to his allies as to his enemies. The boy from Naples who once dreamed of more than survival was becoming something else entirely. He was stepping into a world where survival meant taking another man's place, where respect was measured in fear, and where every ally was a potential rival. Late at night, when the streets finally quieted, when the last shouts faded and the city settled into uneasy silence, Vito walked those streets with a kind of restless certainty. He was no longer just part of Little Italy. He was shaping it. And though he did not yet know it, every step was leading him closer to a future soaked in power and in blood. The enforcer had been born. The underworld had welcomed him. But the real question hung in the air like smoke from a dying cigar. How far would he go, and who would have to fall for him to rise? The answer was coming, and the streets of Little Italy would never be the same. Chapter 4: Prohibition and Power. The first bottle smashed on the cobblestones with a crack so sharp it echoed like a gunshot. But it wasn't a bullet. It was whiskey, good whiskey, pouring into the gutter under the dim glow of a lamppost. Crowds of officers in dark coats lined the street, seizing barrels, busting crates, tossing liquor into the dirt. In January of 1920, America officially went dry. The 18th Amendment outlawed the manufacture, sale, and transport of alcohol. And in the very moment when most Americans lost something, the underworld gained everything. The law had drawn a line in the sand. The men brave enough, or ruthless enough, to cross it stood on the threshold of power. Vito Genovese was there, young and hungry, watching opportunity flood the streets like spilled wine. To the average immigrant family, Prohibition meant frustration. It meant no more casual glasses of wine at dinner, no more beer after long shifts in the factory. For Vito and the men he was beginning to align with, it meant a river of money waiting to be tapped. Where there is demand, supply will follow. And demand for liquor did not vanish with the stroke of a pen, it multiplied. The city changed overnight. Behind butcher shops and barber chairs, speakeasies blossomed. Hidden clubs pulsed with music, laughter, and smoke. Judges and policemen were bribed to look the other way. Trucks rumbled in the dark, carrying illegal shipments across state lines. A nation that had tried to sober itself ended up drunker than ever. And the ones pouring the drinks weren't bartenders anymore. They were gangsters. Vito quickly saw the shape of the new game. Bootlegging wasn't simply about moving alcohol. It was about creating an empire. Trucks needed protection. Warehouses needed guards. Buyers needed assurance they were safe from rivals. That was where enforcers like Vito thrived. He had already made his mark as a street-level tough, but Prohibition opened doors far wider than he ever imagined. He joined the operations of the rising powers in New York, men like Joe Masseria, and later Lucky Luchiano. Their networks stretched across boroughs, bringing in liquor from Canada, from Europe, from backwoods stills hidden in forests. The profits were staggering. For the first time, the Mafia families were no longer scraping for coins. They were drowning in cash. Vito, with his cold efficiency and taste for violence, became essential to keeping that machine running. On nights when rival crews tried to hijack shipments, Vito was there. He learned quickly that bootlegging wars weren't fought with contracts. They were fought with pistols in the dark. A truck would vanish, a body would turn up in the Hudson, and the message was clear. This business was bloodstained, and only the strongest would survive. Vito thrived in it. He had no hesitation, no trembling hand. If a man stood in the way, he was removed. Simple as that. Prohibition also gave him a taste of real wealth. Suits replaced shabby coats. He ate meals at fine restaurants instead of scraping plates clean at home. He slipped bills into the hands of waiters and cab drivers, and for the first time, people looked at him not as another poor immigrant, but as someone to be respected or feared. In the underworld, respect and fear were two sides of the same coin. But there was more than money at stake. Prohibition wasn't just fueling gangsters. It was shaping the future of organized crime itself. What had once been scattered street crews was beginning to harden into families, structured hierarchies that mimicked corporations. At the top sat bosses who coordinated entire networks. Beneath them, lieutenants, captains, soldiers, and associates. Bootlegging demanded organization, discipline, and coordination. Without it, chaos swallowed you whole. Vito understood this better than most. He wasn't just swinging fists anymore. He was learning how the machinery of power turned. He watched how bosses gave orders, how money was collected and distributed, how territory was protected like sacred ground. Every warehouse, every speakeasy, every smuggled shipment was a gear in a much larger clock. And if one gear broke, the whole system stopped. He absorbed it like scripture, knowing that one day, he would want to turn the gears himself. Yet, behind the glamour, the streets of New York ran red. Prohibition ignited wars between gangs that saw dozens of men gunned down in alleys, restaurants, and even in broad daylight. Vito was part of that storm, a soldier who delivered punishment without remorse. He understood that violence wasn't simply cruelty, it was negotiation. A bullet was a contract no one could argue against. A beating was a signature that lasted longer than ink. In a city trying to legislate morality, crime had become the truest business of all. He rose quickly. Men twice his age followed his orders because he delivered results. He knew how to make people pay up, how to make rivals back down, how to make silence hang heavier than words. His ambition was no longer a quiet ember. It was a flame, visible to anyone who looked too closely. Still, there were dangers. The police were stretched thin, but they weren't blind. Federal agents, the so-called Prohibition men, raided warehouses and smashed barrels. Sometimes they got lucky. Sometimes they were paid off. Vito saw both sides. He saw men led away in cuffs, faces pale with fear. And he saw men slip envelopes across polished tables, smiling as the same officers looked away. To him, the lesson was simple: laws weren't barriers. They were business expenses. For the immigrants in Little Italy, Prohibition had a strange effect. Families who once despised crime now relied on it. A cousin got a job guarding a truck. An uncle made money serving drinks at a speakeasy. A neighbor who had been poor for years suddenly walked around with new shoes, his pockets heavy with coins. The underworld was no longer distant. It was the heartbeat of survival. And Vito, standing at the center of it, felt more powerful with each passing year. His violence became legend. There were whispers of men who crossed him, only to vanish. Stories of gamblers who tried to cheat, only to limp away, broken and bleeding. To ordinary citizens, these tales spread fear. To men of power, they spread respect. Violence, after all, was advertisement. And Vito's reputation was becoming impossible to ignore. But ambition is a dangerous drug. The more he tasted power, the more he wanted. He wasn't content with being a soldier. He wanted territory, influence, authority. He wanted to sit at the tables where decisions were made, where fortunes were built not by fists, but by whispers and handshakes. And slowly, inevitably, he began moving in that direction. The bosses of the era noticed. Joe Masseria, one of the most feared men in New York, saw potential in the sharp young enforcer. Lucky Luchiano, rising himself, recognized a kindred spirit, ruthless, pragmatic, and hungry. Vito became entangled in their worlds, rising from back-alley bruiser to a man trusted with higher tasks. Each job completed flawlessly added another stone to the foundation of his future empire. Still, danger clung to every step. Rival gangs lurked like wolves, ready to strike. Federal agents, growing more aggressive, sought to dismantle the bootlegging empires brick by brick. And inside the Mafia itself, tensions simmered. The more money Prohibition poured in, the more power struggles it created. Alliances were fragile. Loyalties were tested. Vito had to tread carefully, balancing obedience with ambition, violence with calculation. One night, after a successful shipment, Vito stood on a rooftop overlooking the city. The streets below pulsed with life. Cars, lights, music spilling from hidden clubs. The air smelled of smoke and spilled beer. For a moment, he let himself imagine what lay ahead. Not just being feared in a neighborhood, not just running errands for men above him, but ruling, controlling the gears of the whole machine. He could see it, taste it, almost touch it. But ambition, as always, came with cost. The Prohibition era was a battlefield disguised as a party. Men were killed in restaurants, gunned down in front of their families, dumped into rivers like garbage. Every rise meant someone else's fall. Every dollar earned was stained with blood. Vito knew this. He accepted it. But in the quiet moments, he must have wondered, how long could he walk this path before the bullets turned his way? By the end of the 1920s, the Mafia was no longer just a collection of thugs. It was becoming an empire. The money from bootlegging built networks that would last long after Prohibition ended. Families solidified. Power structures hardened. And at the center of it all, young men like Vito carved out reputations that would define their lives. The immigrant boy who once watched gangsters with wide eyes was now one of them. His fists, his knife, his cold stare, all had bought him a place in the world of power. But the climb was only beginning. The streets of Little Italy had given him his start. Prohibition had given him his fuel. And now, the real war for the soul of New York's underworld was about to erupt. As the decade closed, one question lingered in the smoky air of speakeasies and backrooms. Who would control the empire when the dust settled? Vito Genovese already had his answer. He would stop at nothing to make sure it was him. And the city, still roaring with jazz and whiskey, had no idea how much blood was yet to come. Chapter 5, Masseria's Man. The restaurant was loud with clinking glasses and the heavy laughter of men who believed themselves untouchable. Cigarette smoke curled toward the ceiling, thick as fog, carrying with it the stench of whiskey and garlic. But beneath that laughter, beneath the music of forks against plates, there was a silence nobody acknowledged, a silence born from fear. Every man at that table knew who sat at the head. Joe Masseria, the boss, a man who could order life or death between bites of pasta. And standing in the shadows, quiet but watchful, was the young enforcer who would soon carve his way into legend. Vito Genovese. Masseria's empire stretched across New York like an invisible web. Every speakeasy, every gambling den, every loan shark in Little Italy paid tribute. He had the politicians in his pocket, the cops on his payroll, and a reputation built on rivers of blood. To work for Masseria was both an honor and a death sentence. You were fed, you were feared, but you were also marked. The police knew your name. Rivals knew your face. Survival meant more than loyalty. It meant proving, again and again, that you were willing to do whatever was asked. That was where Vito excelled. By the early 1920s, Genovese had already shown a taste for violence that separated him from the rest. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't sloppy. He was clinical, like a surgeon who believed blood was just part of the job. When Masseria needed a man dealt with, whether it was a gambler refusing to pay or a rival whispering too loudly about territory, Vito was sent. And every time, the problem disappeared. His rise under Masseria wasn't just about muscle. It was about dependability. In a world where betrayal was as common as bread, Vito was steady. He didn't complain, didn't hesitate, didn't flinch. He understood the rules of the underworld long before others his age. Power was about perception. To be feared was to be safe. To be ruthless was to be respected. And the more he embodied those traits, the closer Masseria pulled him into the circle. But working for Masseria came at a cost. The man was not just a boss, he was a tyrant. Known as Joe the Boss, he demanded absolute loyalty, absolute obedience, absolute tribute. His enemies saw him as arrogant, paranoid, and greedy. But to men like Vito, his rule offered opportunity. If Masseria was the sun, then standing close to him meant you could bask in the warmth, so long as you didn't get burned. The jobs grew darker. Collections turned into beatings. Beatings turned into killings. Each act was a test, a way to measure whether this young enforcer could handle the true weight of Mafia life. And Vito never failed. Witnesses vanished. Debts were repaid in silence. Rivals found themselves staring down the barrel of inevitability. With each task completed, Vito's name carried more weight in whispers across Little Italy. He was no longer just a boy from Naples. He was Masseria's man. It wasn't only the violence that earned him respect, it was his ambition. Unlike many soldiers who drowned themselves in quick riches and fleeting pleasures, Vito thought long-term. He studied Masseria's habits, his routines, his ways of controlling men through fear and money. He watched how power was not taken all at once, but built piece by piece, like stacking bricks until the wall was too tall to climb. Genovese wasn't just playing the role of an enforcer. He was rehearsing for the day he would sit at the head of the table. The streets of New York in the 1920s were chaos, but they were also alive. Prohibition kept the money flowing, but it also fueled wars. Rival gangs clashed in alleys. Gunfire rattled through the night like thunder. For the common people of Little Italy, it was terrifying. For the Mafia, it was business as usual. And in that storm, men like Vito thrived. He carried a gun the way a priest carried a rosary. Always close, always ready, always a reminder of his faith in violence. One story told in hushed voices spoke of a man who had insulted Masseria, refusing to pay tribute. It was Vito who was sent to deliver the message. He walked into the man's store in broad daylight. No mask, no attempt at disguise. Minutes later, the man lay bleeding on the floor, his pride shattered along with his body. To bystanders, it was shocking. To Vito, it was routine. He wasn't trying to hide. He was trying to teach. Fear, after all, was most effective when everyone could see it. But there was another side to his reputation. He was not a loud man. He did not boast in bars or brag about his work. He let silence speak for him. And in a world where talk was often cheap, silence was priceless. It made people wonder. It made people afraid. In many ways, his quietness was more intimidating than the shouting and gun-waving of lesser gangsters. He carried himself like someone who had already accepted the price of his life, and that made him dangerous beyond measure. Still, working under Masseria meant walking on glass. The boss had enemies everywhere. Rival families saw his arrogance as weakness. Younger men like Lucky Luchiano began to whisper about the need for change. And in those whispers, a new future for the Mafia was taking shape. Vito stood at the crossroads. For now, he was Masseria's man, loyal, effective, unshakable. But loyalty in the Mafia was never permanent. It was a coin you spent when it benefited you most. At night, after carrying out another order, after wiping blood from his hands and slipping his pistol back into its holster, Vito would walk the streets of Little Italy with a strange calm. The city buzzed around him, music pouring from speakeasies, couples arguing in doorways, children darting between lamplight and shadow. To most, New York was a place of struggle and survival. To Vito, it was a chessboard, and every move he made was positioning him closer to the throne. His parents, still clinging to their faith and simple lives, had little idea of what their son had become. To them, he was successful, bringing home more money than they had ever seen. But even if they suspected the truth, they turned their eyes away. In immigrant families, silence was its own form of survival. The world outside, however, was watching. Police files began to mention his name. Rivals began to mark his face. And within the Mafia itself, whispers spread. Masseria trusted him. Others feared him. But trust and fear are fragile things. One wrong step, one miscalculation, and the man who was rising could just as quickly be erased. By the mid-1920s, Vito had transformed from an immigrant boy into a man with a reputation. He was no longer seen as disposable muscle. He was an asset, a figure whose name carried weight in the smoky backrooms of New York's underworld. And yet, beneath every nod of respect, beneath every whispered acknowledgement of his growing influence, lay a question no one dared ask aloud. How long would he remain Masseria's man? The answer was coming. And when it did, it would change the Mafia forever. Chapter 6: Alliance with Luchiano. The card game was supposed to be ordinary. Cigars glowing, whiskey glasses half full, men leaning forward over the green felt table. But hidden beneath the shuffle of cards and the clink of coins, history itself was about to turn. Joe Masseria, Joe the boss, sat relaxed, his thick fingers drumming against the table. He believed himself untouchable. What he did not know was that the men at the table were not playing cards that day. They were playing with his life. Among those plotting behind the curtain of smoke was Vito Genovese, the once loyal soldier who now stood ready to help bring down the very man he had served. The late 1920s had set New York ablaze with what came to be known as the Castellammarese War. It was not a war fought on distant battlefields, but on the streets of the city itself. Blood ran through alleyways, bodies dropped outside storefronts, and fear hung thick in every Italian neighborhood. The war was simple in principle, but brutal in execution. On one side stood Joe Masseria, clinging to his title of boss of bosses, demanding absolute loyalty, tribute, and obedience. On the other side, from Castellammare del Golfo in Sicily, came Salvatore Maranzano, with a vision of a new order, one that challenged Masseria's arrogance and claimed he alone should lead. Caught in the middle were men like Charles Lucky Luchiano, Frank Costello, and Vito Genovese. They had worked under Masseria, tasted power, and grown rich from Prohibition. But as the war dragged on, they began to see what others already whispered. Masseria was not the future. He was the past. His methods were blunt, greedy, clumsy. He treated men as disposable tools, not partners. And in a world where power was shifting like sand, clinging to the past meant drowning in it. For Vito, loyalty had always been a coin to spend wisely, never a burden to carry. He had once been Masseria's man, delivering punishment with ruthless efficiency. But he was ambitious, and ambition has no patience for stagnation. He saw in Luchiano something Masseria lacked: vision. Luchiano was not content with the old ways of the Mafia, where bosses demanded tribute and men killed blindly for honor. He wanted an organization that functioned like a corporation, with structure, balance, and strategy. To Vito, it was clear. Masseria represented the old world. Luchiano represented the new. The decision to betray Masseria was not made in one night. It was whispered over countless evenings, in quiet conversations behind locked doors, in meetings where every word had to be weighed as carefully as a loaded gun. Luchiano and his closest allies, Genovese, Costello, and Lansky, spoke of a future where they no longer bent the knee to men who demanded loyalty without earning respect. They envisioned a syndicate where profit outweighed ego, where violence was measured and not wasted, where alliances replaced endless blood feuds. But turning against Masseria was not just a gamble. It was a death sentence if discovered. Men who even hinted at disloyalty often ended up face down in the gutter before sunrise. Vito knew this. Yet, his cold confidence carried him forward. He had already lived long enough to understand the truth of power. It was never truly loyal to anyone. It moved like smoke, finding the sharpest, strongest man to cling to. And right now, that man was not Masseria. It was Luchiano. The Castellammarese War raged on, each side losing soldiers, each day filled with ambushes, betrayals, and funerals. The city's Italian neighborhoods lived under a cloud of dread. Mothers whispered prayers, wives clutched children, and young men walked the streets knowing that any day, a bullet might find them simply because of who they stood beside. In this storm, Vito's role became more defined. He acted as Luciano's iron fist, a man who could be trusted to carry out the dirtiest orders without hesitation. Violence was his language, and in a war defined by blood, he spoke it fluently. But beyond the bloodshed, there was strategy. Luciano's plan was not just to win, but to reshape the entire underworld. The Mafia as it existed under Masseria was chaotic, a mess of traditions and rivalries. Luchiano wanted something modern, efficient, and he knew Masseria would never agree. The only solution was to remove him, permanently. The betrayal was planned with cold precision. Luchiano pretended loyalty until the very end, meeting with Masseria, laughing at his jokes, playing the role of obedient protégé. All the while, the trap was tightening. Vito Genovese was there in the background, silent, watchful, waiting for the signal. It was not just another job. It was the turning point of his life. He had killed before, yes, but this was different. This was betrayal on the grandest scale. This was cutting the throat of the man who had once lifted him from obscurity. April of 1931. The day was quiet, deceptively so. Masseria agreed to meet Luchiano at a restaurant in Coney Island. He believed it was business as usual, just another card game with his trusted men. Luchiano excused himself to the bathroom, leaving the old boss at the table with his cards spread in front of him. In those seconds of absence, the door opened, and the betrayers walked in, Vito Genovese among them. The silence of the restaurant shattered under the roar of gunfire. Masseria's body slumped forward, cards still clutched in his hand, blood staining the green felt. In one brutal instant, the reign of Joe the boss ended, and the future Luchiano had envisioned began. For Vito, it was the ultimate test of loyalty and the ultimate act of betrayal. He had proven himself once again, not just as an enforcer, but as a man willing to sacrifice anything, even the man who had once given him power, for the sake of ambition. There was no regret in his eyes that day, only calculation. Masseria had been useful, and now he was not. That was all. The fallout was immediate. With Masseria gone, Maranzano claimed victory in the Castellammarese War. But Luchiano, Genovese, and their allies had already set their sights higher. They would not trade one tyrant for another. They would not bow their heads forever. The betrayal of Masseria was only the beginning of a much larger shift. And Vito, who had once been just a soldier in the shadows, was now seated at the table where history was being written. At night, when the city settled into uneasy silence, when the smoke from the restaurants drifted into the sky, Vito must have felt the weight of what he had done. But if he did, he carried it without flinching. Betrayal, after all, was not shameful in his world. It was survival. It was ambition. It was the cost of climbing higher. The immigrant boy from Naples had once watched men with awe, dreaming of the day he might sit among them. Now he was one of them, and the climb was only just beginning. But betrayal is a seed that never dies quietly. It lingers in memory, in whispers, in the suspicious eyes of men who know that if you could betray one boss, you could betray another. Vito had chosen Luchiano, and it had given him power. Yet in the shadows of that choice, danger was already waiting. Because in the world of the Mafia, today's ally could be tomorrow's corpse, and the men Vito now stood beside would one day wonder, when would he turn on them? Chapter 7. The Death of Joe Masseria. The sound of cards sliding across felt was soft, almost gentle. A shuffle here, a chuckle there, glasses clinking faintly on the table. It was April of 1931, and Joe Masseria, Joe the boss, leaned back in his chair inside a small Coney Island restaurant. His heavy frame filled the seat as though the room itself bent around him. He was laughing, savoring his wine, holding court the way he always had, with arrogance, with the assurance that he was untouchable. The war with Salvatore Maranzano was dragging on, yes, but Masseria was certain he would outlast everyone. After all, he had outlasted countless rivals before. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that the very men who sat closest to him were no longer his shield. They were his executioners. Charles Lucky, Luchiano excused himself from the table, claiming he needed the restroom. It was an innocent enough gesture, a small movement in the rhythm of the game. Masseria barely noticed. He held his cards in his thick fingers, his cigar burning lazily at the edge of an ashtray. His men had always been loyal. He had no reason to suspect betrayal. Loyalty, after all, was what he demanded above all else. But in the world of the Mafia, loyalty was a temporary currency, and Masseria had overplayed his hand. The door opened. 4 men stepped inside: Vito Genovese, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel. They moved quickly, quietly, like wolves closing in on prey. The restaurant was not crowded, only a few others scattered in corners, but in that moment, time seemed to freeze. The laughter stopped. The air grew heavy. Masseria looked up from his cards, perhaps sensing, too late, that something was wrong. The guns came out. The roar of gunfire shattered the quiet. Masseria's body jerked as bullets tore through him. Cards scattered like fallen leaves, drifting across the blood-slicked table. His cigar tumbled to the floor, burning out in silence. Within seconds, it was over. The man who had once claimed to be boss of bosses lay slumped forward, his empire crumbling with the shuffle of a deck. For Vito Genovese, pulling that trigger was not hesitation, it was destiny. He had once been Masseria's loyal soldier, enforcing his will, delivering violence on his command. But ambition had no room for sentiment. Masseria had become an obstacle. Luchiano offered the future. Vito chose survival, and survival meant betrayal. Outside, the world went on as if nothing had happened. Families strolled the boardwalk. Children licked melting ice cream cones. The ocean waves lapped against the shore. No one knew that, inside a dim restaurant, the course of American organized crime had just changed forever. The assassination was not simply the end of one man. It was the end of an era. Masseria had ruled with arrogance, demanding tribute from every corner of New York. He treated his soldiers as disposable pawns, never as partners. That model had worked for a time, but the Prohibition years had changed everything. The Mafia was no longer a loose collection of gangs scraping for survival. It was becoming a business, a multinational empire fueled by bootlegging, gambling, and narcotics. And Masseria, with his old-world ways and greedy hands, could not keep up. Luchiano understood that. He wanted an organization that ran like a corporation, structured and profitable, where violence was used strategically, not recklessly. And Vito, ever the opportunist, saw his chance to align himself with that vision. Betraying Masseria wasn't just about survival. It was about climbing higher, faster, into the inner circle of power. The fallout was immediate. News of Masseria's death rippled through the underworld like an earthquake. Men who had once pledged allegiance to him scrambled to realign, to swear loyalty to Maranzano, who now stood as the dominant force. But they also watched Luchiano and his crew, men who had pulled the trigger that day. They had proven themselves ruthless, unafraid of spilling blood even against their own boss. In the Mafia, that kind of boldness was both admired and feared. For Vito, it was the ultimate test passed. He had shown that his loyalty was not to a man, but to power itself. It was a dangerous lesson, one that would follow him for the rest of his life. If he could betray Masseria, he could betray anyone. And yet, in that betrayal lay his greatest strength. He was not weighed down by sentiment. He was guided only by ambition. The public, meanwhile, barely understood the magnitude of what had happened. Newspapers reported the shooting as another gangland killing, one more body in a war the police seemed unable or unwilling to control. But those in the know understood. This was not random. This was the surgical removal of a boss who had outlived his usefulness. And behind that act stood Vito Genovese, no longer just a soldier, but a trusted figure in the reshaping of the Mafia. At night, in the silence after the storm, Vito must have replayed the moment in his head. The feel of the gun in his hand. The sight of Masseria's body slumping forward, cards slipping from his fingers. It wasn't regret that haunted him. It was clarity. He had crossed another line, and each line he crossed only made the next one easier. But betrayal has its own weight. Even as he rose higher, even as Luciano's vision began to take shape, a question hung in the air. If Vito could turn on Masseria, could he one day turn on Luchiano as well? Trust in the Mafia was always fragile, always conditional. Men shook hands with one another while wondering if those same hands would one day aim a pistol at their backs. For now, though, the betrayal had paid off. Masseria was gone. Luchiano and his allies were rising, and Vito had secured his place among them. He was no longer just a street enforcer. He was part of the inner circle, a man whose name carried weight not just in Little Italy, but across the entire underworld of New York. The immigrant boy from Naples, who once watched men in awe from the shadows, was now one of the architects of history. The streets he had once walked as a hungry teenager were now his territory. Fear followed him, respect surrounded him, and ambition pushed him forward. But in the shadows, danger never disappeared. Maranzano was now the boss. And while Luciano's betrayal had given Vito power, it had also planted a seed of suspicion in every man who knew the story. If he could betray once, he could betray again. And as the dust settled in Coney Island, as the cards lay scattered across a table soaked in blood, one truth remained unshakable. Vito Genovese had chosen his side. But in the Mafia, sides shift like tides. And the tide was far from finished. The war was not over. It was only changing shape. And in that shifting storm, Vito's hunger for power was only just beginning to reveal itself. Chapter 8. The Birth of the Commission. The room was quiet, too quiet for men who had just survived years of war. Cigars burned low, smoke coiling in the stale air. The Castellammarese war had ended, the bodies buried, the blood dried. Salvatore Maranzano had declared himself capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses, but his reign was short-lived. Within months, he was cut down by men who once bowed at his table. His arrogance had made him blind, his hunger for control made him careless. And in that silence that followed his murder, a new order was about to be born. At the center of it all sat Charles "Lucky" Luchiano, calm, composed, and sharper than anyone else in the room. And beside him, watching, listening, waiting for his moment, was Vito Genovese. Luciano's vision was unlike anything the old-world bosses could imagine. For decades, the Mafia in America had operated like feudal lords, each boss ruling his territory with an iron fist, demanding tribute, punishing disloyalty with death. But these constant power struggles had turned New York into a battlefield. Blood feuds stretched across generations. The Castellammarese War had proven what happened when men fought endlessly for the crown. Too many died, too much money was lost, and the public's gaze grew sharper. Luchiano wanted something different. He wanted structure, order, a way to make the Mafia more like a business and less like a medieval battlefield. So he created the Commission. It was a bold idea. Instead of one man ruling as boss of bosses, the Commission would act as a board of directors. Each of the major families would have a seat at the table. Disputes would be settled through meetings, not wars. Territories would be divided and respected, profits shared without constant bloodshed. It was democracy by Mafia standards, still ruthless, still brutal, but smarter. For men like Vito, this was opportunity disguised as reform. He had lived through the chaos, seen men slaughtered in alleys, seen bosses fall with cards still in their hands. Now he saw a chance to climb higher within a system that rewarded ambition. Luchiano trusted him, and that trust meant power. Genovese was no longer just a soldier. He was becoming a lieutenant, a man whose word carried weight in the decisions that shaped the entire underworld. The first meetings of the Commission were tense. Imagine a room filled with men who had once tried to kill each other, now expected to sit side by side and speak calmly. Behind every smile was suspicion, behind every handshake the memory of betrayal. But money has a way of smoothing over grudges, and Prohibition was still pouring cash into their pockets. The idea of peace, at least temporary peace, was too profitable to ignore. Luchiano spoke of efficiency. He compared the Mafia to corporations like Standard Oil or U.S. Steel, vast machines where every part had its place. Why should their world be different? Why spill blood over scraps when they could pool resources, share profits, and focus their violence only when absolutely necessary? The old bosses had ruled with fear. Luchiano wanted to rule with logic, and behind that logic was cold calculation. He knew a unified Mafia would be untouchable. Vito sat at his side, absorbing every word. For him, this was confirmation of everything he had believed since his days in Naples. Power wasn't about loyalty to tradition. It wasn't about old codes whispered in Sicily. It was about control, about turning crime into an industry as sleek and unstoppable as any legitimate business. And with Luchiano at the helm, Vito's path toward greater influence was wide open. But the Commission was not just about structure. It was about survival. By creating a governing body, Luchiano eliminated the need for one supreme boss. This meant no one man could become too powerful. No one man could paint a target on his back the way Maranzano had. It was a safeguard against ambition consuming itself. Yet within that safeguard was a paradox. Men like Genovese thrived on ambition. They wanted more than a seat at the table. They wanted the table itself. For the moment, though, Vito played his role perfectly. He enforced decisions, collected debts, and ensured loyalty. When the Commission divided territories, he made sure his crew got their share. When disputes flared, he was the quiet reminder of what could happen if rules were broken. Violence had not disappeared under Luciano's system. It had simply become more organized. Instead of random killings, there were calculated strikes. Instead of chaos, there was method. And in that method, Vito's skills were invaluable. The people of New York saw little of these meetings, but they felt the effects. The streets grew quieter, at least compared to the blood-soaked years before. Speakeasies thrived, gambling houses flourished, and the flow of liquor remained steady. Behind it all was the machine of the commission, humming quietly, efficiently, invisibly. To outsiders, it looked like peace. To insiders, it was control. Still, the creation of the commission did not erase suspicion. Every man at that table knew the truth. Peace was temporary. Trust was temporary. At any moment, alliances could fracture, and the knives would come out again. Vito understood this better than anyone. He had betrayed Masseria without flinching. He would betray again if it served his purpose. But for now, loyalty to Luchiano meant survival, and survival meant opportunity. Late at night, when the meetings ended and the streets emptied, Vito must have felt the weight of his climb. He was no longer just an immigrant boy running errands, no longer just a soldier breaking bones for tribute. He was part of the foundation of something bigger than himself, something that would outlast Prohibition, outlast Maranzano, outlast even Luchiano. The commission was not just a council, it was an empire. And empires needed men like Vito to keep the gears turning. The irony was not lost on him. In Naples, he had learned the lessons of the Camorra: fear, loyalty, silence. In New York, he had sharpened them into weapons. And now, sitting beside Luchiano, he saw those lessons being institutionalized, carved into the structure of organized crime itself. The commission was simply the Camorra reborn on a grander scale, a shadow government ruling not one city, but the entire underworld of America. But ambition, once fed, is never satisfied. As the commission solidified, as Luchiano rose to the top, Vito's hunger only grew. He had proven himself loyal, yes, but loyalty was always conditional. He wanted more than influence. He wanted command. And though he sat silently in those early meetings, listening, learning, calculating, deep inside, he must have wondered how long it would be before the seat at Luciano's side became the seat at Luciano's place. For now, the system worked. For now, peace held. But history has a way of repeating itself. Just as Masseria had fallen, just as Maranzano had fallen, one day, others would fall too. And when that day came, Vito Genovese intended to be ready. As the smoke curled toward the ceiling and the men of the commission shook hands, sealing their uneasy alliance, one truth lingered in the room like the smell of whiskey and cigars. The Mafia had been reborn, sharper, stronger, more dangerous than ever. And in its rebirth, Vito Genovese had found his place. But the commission was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning. And in the shadows of its success, betrayal still waited, silent and patient, ready to strike again. Chapter 9. The Gigante Murder. The shot rang out in the cramped backroom like a hammer striking steel. For a split second, silence followed. A heavy, suffocating silence. Then came the gasps, the shuffle of chairs, the scrape of men rushing to the door. Ferdinand Boccia collapsed against the table, cards scattering across the floor, blood pooling beneath him. His eyes wide, his mouth open, but no words came. Just like that, the argument, the insults, the feud that had been boiling for months was finished. And the man holding the smoking pistol, calm, steady, almost indifferent, was Vito Genovese. It was 1937, and Vito had just crossed another line. Not with some random street tough or disposable soldier, but with a man who had once been considered an ally. The murder of Ferdinand Boccia was not a rash decision. It was a calculated act, the kind of strike that defined Vito's reputation. It showed everyone in the underworld exactly what he was capable of. But it also set into motion a chain of events that would drive him out of New York, across the ocean, and into exile. The story began, as many in the Mafia did, with money and pride. Boccia and Genovese had partnered in a gambling venture, a lucrative business built on the desperation of men who couldn't resist the roll of dice or the turn of a card. But gambling in those days was never clean. Every profit carried suspicion, every loss carried blame. When Boccia accused Vito of cheating him, of shorting him in a deal, it wasn't just an insult. It was a declaration of war. To men like Boccia, arguments could be settled with words, sometimes with threats, sometimes with compromises. But to Vito, insult was intolerable. In his mind, reputation was everything. If he allowed Boccia to walk away after challenging him, others would see weakness. Weakness in the Mafia was like blood in the water. Once it was spotted, the sharks came circling. So the choice was simple. Either Boccia died, or Vito's future did. The meeting that night was arranged under the pretense of reconciliation. Boccia thought they were going to talk, to smooth things over, maybe cut a new deal. He probably walked into that back room with relief in his chest, thinking the feud would finally end. But what he didn't understand was that the ending had already been written. For Vito, the meeting wasn't negotiation, it was execution. When the gun came out, there was no hesitation, no dramatic speech, no warning, just the sharp crack of a bullet and the sight of a man's life draining away onto the floor. Vito didn't linger. He didn't gloat. He did what he always did, acted quickly, decisively, and then disappeared into the night, leaving behind a corpse and a message louder than any words. That message was clear. Cross Vito Genovese, and you wouldn't live to regret it. In the days that followed, the streets buzzed with whispers. Boccia had been connected, respected in his own circles. His murder didn't just remove a rival. It sent shockwaves through the underworld. Men who had once doubted Vito's resolve now knew the truth. He was ruthless, unflinching, willing to kill even a man who had once shared his table. Fear is the most powerful weapon in the Mafia, and with Boccia's death, Vito sharpened his blade to perfection. But fear cuts both ways. Boccia's murder drew attention, not just from the underworld, but from the law. The police were not blind. They had watched Vito's rise with unease, noted his proximity to Luchiano and the growing syndicate. Now, with a high-profile killing tied to his name, they saw an opportunity. Witnesses emerged, whispers turned into testimonies. For the first time, Vito found himself in the crosshairs of more than just rivals. He had built his life on precision, on staying one step ahead of danger. But the Boccia case threatened to undo it all. If the law could pin the murder on him, his climb would end in a cell. And for a man like Vito, prison was worse than death. It was power stripped bare, ambition locked away behind bars. He could not allow that to happen. So he made a choice. The same way he had chosen to betray Masseria, the same way he had chosen to kill Boccia, Vito chose survival once more. When pressure mounted, when indictments loomed, he fled. He left New York behind and crossed the ocean back to Italy, returning to the land of his birth. To the outside world, it might have looked like retreat. But to Vito, it was strategy. Italy in the late 1930s was not the Naples of his childhood. Benito Mussolini's fascist regime had transformed the country into a stage of propaganda and power. For a man like Vito, it was fertile ground. He still had connections, ties to the Camorra, ties to old friends who had grown into new positions of influence. In exile, he would not shrink. He would adapt. He would turn Italy into his next arena. But in New York, his absence was felt. Some saw it as weakness, others as cunning. His enemies celebrated, thinking the law had finally cornered him. His allies, though, knew better. Vito was not the kind of man who disappeared forever. He was patient, like a snake slipping into the grass, waiting for the moment to strike again. The Boccia murder cemented his reputation in two ways. To the underworld, it confirmed that Vito was deadly serious, a man who would not hesitate to eliminate even those close to him. To the law, it branded him a fugitive, a marked man whose return would always be shadowed by indictments and trials. For Vito, that dual reputation was not a burden, it was power. He thrived on the fear, on the uncertainty he left behind. Still, in the quiet of exile, he must have reflected on what had happened. The blood on the floor, the scattered cards, the look in Boccia's eyes as life drained away. Men like Vito did not waste time on regret, but even he must have known that this murder had changed everything. It had forced his hand, exiled him from the empire he had worked to build. Yet even in exile, he remained dangerous, perhaps more dangerous than before, because exile is not always defeat. Sometimes it is preparation. And while New York carried on without him, while Luchiano and others continued to expand the Commission's reach, Vito was sharpening his claws across the ocean, biding his time. The murder of Ferdinand Boccia was not just another killing in the endless list of Mafia vendettas. It was a turning point, a fracture line in Vito's story. It showed the world who he really was, a man who valued power above loyalty, reputation above friendship, ambition above everything. And it forced him to leave the city he intended to rule. But exile would not erase him. It would not weaken him. If anything, it would make his return all the more inevitable. And somewhere in the shadows of Italy, as Mussolini's fascist banners waved in the streets, Vito Genovese was already plotting his next move. Chapter 10: Flight to Naples. The ship cut across the Atlantic, its bow slamming into dark waves, carrying more than just passengers fleeing New York. Somewhere on that vessel, far from the reach of American courts, Vito Genovese leaned against the railing, staring into the endless water. Behind him, he left a city buzzing with whispers of murder, a trail of blood that pointed directly at him. Ahead of him, Italy, the land of his birth, a place he had left as a boy, now waiting to welcome him back as a man with money, power, and ambition. He wasn't running away, not in his mind. He was advancing to a new front. It was 1937, and U.S. authorities had every reason to want him. The killing of Ferdinand Boccia had lit up headlines, and witnesses had come forward ready to put Vito in a courtroom. If he stayed, he would face trial, prison, maybe even the end of his climb. But Vito had always believed in choosing survival over sentiment. America had given him power, but if America threatened to take it away, he had no problem cutting ties. Survival wasn't cowardice. It was strategy. And for Vito, strategy always came first. When he stepped back onto Italian soil, the air smelled different. War clouds gathered on the horizon. Benito Mussolini's fascist banners hung from balconies, fluttering over cobblestone streets. Soldiers marched in black uniforms, their boots striking the ground in rhythm, a sound meant to remind everyone who was in charge. Italy wasn't the same place Vito had left decades earlier. It was harder, darker, wrapped in the iron grip of dictatorship. But for a man like Vito, that grip was an invitation. Dictatorships thrive on loyalty, on money, on favors. And Vito had all three to offer. He set himself up in Naples, living with a kind of luxury that seemed obscene compared to his childhood poverty. Fine suits, expensive meals, grand villas that echoed with marble floors. He was no longer the hungry immigrant boy running errands in New York. He was a wealthy man, a power broker, a figure who could sit at Mussolini's table and not look out of place. In the streets, people whispered his name, some in fear, some in awe. To the poor, he was proof that men could escape hunger. To the underworld, he was proof that ambition had no borders. But Genovese's luxury wasn't just about showing off. It was currency. Power in Italy meant more than guns and money. It meant connections. Mussolini's fascist regime was eager to use men like Vito. The dictator's black shirts controlled the streets, but corruption flowed beneath the surface like an underground river. Officials wanted bribes. Bureaucrats wanted favors. Judges wanted influence. Vito could provide all of it. He slipped into this world like a key fitting a lock, forging ties with government figures who knew exactly who he was and exactly what he offered. There were rumors, never fully proven, but whispered with conviction, that Vito even involved himself in political violence. Mussolini's enemies had a way of disappearing. Critics who spoke too loudly ended up silenced, sometimes permanently. Did Vito order the killings? Did he merely facilitate them? Or was he just the man who made sure money and muscle flowed in the right directions? No one can say for certain, but what mattered was perception. And the perception was that Vito Genovese was not just a gangster anymore. He was a man with the ear of the fascist regime. The irony was sharp. In America, he was a fugitive, wanted for murder. In Italy, he was a respected figure, a man whose wealth and ruthlessness made him valuable to those in power. Dictatorships rarely care about morality. They care about control. And in Vito, Mussolini's Italy saw a man who could help maintain it. For Vito himself, it was vindication. He had always believed survival was about adaptation. When the streets demanded violence, he gave it. When the bosses demanded loyalty, he provided it, until it no longer served him. Now, when exile demanded reinvention, he transformed himself into something more than a gangster. He became a political fixer, a shadow power broker, a man who blurred the line between state and underworld. But beneath the polished suits and government connections, Vito remained who he had always been: ambitious, cold, hungry. He understood that Mussolini's world was dangerous, more dangerous than the streets of New York. Dictators had no problem using men like him, then discarding them the moment they became inconvenient. In that world, survival meant not only serving power but staying one step ahead of it. Life in Naples gave Vito everything he had ever wanted as a boy: the villas, the servants, the influence. Yet even in this new life, there must have been moments of unease. Did he ever wonder if the knock at the door would be fascist police, ready to arrest him on some fabricated charge? Did he ever fear that Mussolini's grip might tighten around his own neck? Power in dictatorships is intoxicating, but it is also fragile. The higher you climb, the more dangerous the fall. Meanwhile, back in America, his name did not fade. Prosecutors still wanted him. Rivals still remembered him. His absence did not erase his reputation. If anything, it magnified it. The story of the gangster who fled across the ocean to live like a king spread through New York's underworld. To some, it was a warning. To others, it was inspiration. To Vito, it was a promise. He wasn't finished with America. Not yet. The world itself was changing quickly. By the late 1930s, Europe trembled under the rise of fascism and the looming shadow of war. Mussolini paraded his armies, spoke of empire, and pushed Italy into alliances with Hitler's Germany. For Vito, this meant even greater opportunity. War meant chaos, and chaos meant profit. Black markets thrived, smuggling routes expanded, and men with the right connections could grow richer than ever. Vito positioned himself carefully. He was not just a gangster now. He was a man of influence, someone who could move goods, money, and information across borders. If the fascist regime needed something, he could provide it. If officials wanted protection, he could arrange it. He had built a bridge between the criminal underworld and the state, and he walked across it with ease. Yet there was danger in this new role. Mussolini's Italy was ruthless with those who betrayed it. A wrong move, a careless word, and Vito could vanish like so many others. Still, he thrived. Fear never paralyzed him. If anything, it sharpened him. He lived in a world where every alliance was temporary, every smile could hide a knife. And he was comfortable there. In exile, Vito might have appeared far from the streets of New York, but in truth, he was closer than ever to power. He had learned how to play not only the game of the Mafia, but the game of politics. And in that dangerous overlap, he discovered something vital. Violence could silence enemies. Money could buy influence. But connections, real connections to those who controlled governments, could protect a man in ways no gun ever could. Still, the question lingered. How long could he balance on that edge? How long could he serve Mussolini's regime without becoming its prisoner? How long could he stay away from America before his hunger to return consumed him? As the 1930s closed and war loomed ever larger, Vito stood in Naples, surrounded by wealth, courted by fascist officials, feared by those who whispered his name. But deep inside, he knew one truth had not changed since his boyhood in Rosaliano. Power was never permanent. It always shifted, always demanded new sacrifices, always whispered promises it could not keep. And as the world prepared to tear itself apart in global war, Vito Genovese was preparing too. The exile had given him survival. But survival was not enough. He was already thinking of what came next. Chapter 11. The Black Shirt Connection. The body was found in a ditch outside Naples, hands bound, mouth gagged, a single bullet through the skull. The whispers came quickly. This was no random killing. This was political. The man had spoken too loudly, criticized Mussolini's government one too many times. And in the dark alleys of Naples, the rumors spread like smoke. Vito Genovese's fingerprints were all over it. No, not literally, not in a way the police could prove. But everyone knew. If Mussolini wanted someone silenced, Vito was the man who could make it happen. By the late 1930s, Genovese was more than just a gangster in exile. He had become a shadow figure in Mussolini's Italy, a man whose influence bled into both politics and crime. To the regime, he was useful. He brought money, muscle, and silence. To the underworld, he was terrifying. He had blurred the line between mafia boss and political assassin, moving freely between the streets and the corridors of government. It was a dangerous game, but for Vito, danger was nothing new. Mussolini's black shirts, the paramilitary enforcers of fascism, were infamous for their brutality. They terrorized villages, broke up strikes, beat dissenters into submission. But sometimes, even they needed someone from outside the system, someone who could act without drawing official blame. That's where men like Vito came in. His reputation from America, his willingness to kill without hesitation, made him the perfect weapon. If a political enemy needed to disappear, Vito could arrange it. If a critic needed a message, Vito could deliver it. The evidence of his involvement was always murky, clouded by rumor, never written on paper. That was how Vito liked it. He lived in the shadows, where whispers were more powerful than proof. But in Naples, those whispers became louder. Stories of businessmen who vanished, journalists who never came home, activists who were silenced. Again and again, Genovese's name was there, drifting just behind the smoke of a pistol. Violence was only part of the story. The other part was heroin. While the world prepared for war, Vito saw opportunity in a different kind of conflict, the one fought not with guns, but with powders and needles. International drug smuggling was not new, but under men like Genovese, it became a machine. He forged ties with traffickers in Europe, with chemists who could refine opium into heroin, with sailors who could move shipments across oceans. The same networks that smuggled liquor during Prohibition could just as easily move narcotics. And Vito, always a pragmatist, understood that the profits were far greater. Heroin in the 1930s was not the epidemic it would later become, but it was growing. Addicts in America paid fortunes for tiny packets, fortunes that began their journey in labs in Europe and passed through hands like Vito's. He didn't see drugs as poison. He saw them as business. And business was good. The combination of politics and drugs made him untouchable. With Mussolini's regime on one side and the underworld on the other, Vito stood at a crossroads of power. He could eliminate rivals under the pretense of political necessity. He could smuggle narcotics under the protection of government officials who turned a blind eye for the right price. For a man who had fled New York as a fugitive, it was a remarkable transformation. Yet beneath the surface, there was tension. Fascism demanded loyalty above all else. Mussolini had no use for men who became too powerful, too independent. And Vito, with his growing wealth and influence, was becoming just that. He lived like royalty in Naples, his villas stocked with fine wine, his tables crowded with allies, his pockets heavy with drug money. To some, he was untouchable. To others, he was reckless. The higher he climbed, the more dangerous the fall. Still, he thrived. Violence remained his tool, and he wielded it with the same cold precision that had defined him in America. If a man crossed him, he vanished. If a deal went sour, someone paid the price in blood. To outsiders, it looked like chaos. To Vito, it was order, the same order he had always lived by. Respect through fear. Profit through control. As Europe marched toward war, the stakes grew higher. Mussolini's regime tightened its grip, aligning itself with Hitler, preparing Italy for conflict. In that atmosphere, dissent was deadly, and men like Vito made sure it stayed that way. The whispers of his involvement in political killings grew darker. Some said he helped arrange the assassination of anti-fascist leaders. Others said he funneled money into Mussolini's coffers in exchange for protection. None of it could be proven, but none of it needed to be. In the world Vito lived in, perception was everything. The heroin trade flourished alongside politics. Ships carried cargo that officials pretended not to see. Laboratories refined drugs in secret, their products hidden among crates of legitimate goods. Vito's fingerprints were everywhere, though never visible. He built networks that stretched from Italy to America, ensuring that even in exile, he remained tied to the streets of New York. It was a dangerous balance. On one side, the black shirts, ruthless in their loyalty to Mussolini. On the other, the underworld, ruthless in its loyalty to profit. Vito walked between them like a tightrope artist, careful never to lean too far in either direction. But even the best tightrope walkers stumble. And Vito's steps, though steady, were leading him toward a storm he could not yet see. For the moment, though, he basked in his power. The boy from Rosaliano, once hungry and desperate, now moved in circles where dictators noticed his name. He had wealth, women, villas, and influence that stretched across continents. To many, it seemed as though he had won. He had fled America as a fugitive and transformed himself into a king. But kings are never safe. Dictatorships are built on shifting sands, and men who rise too high risk being swallowed by them. Mussolini trusted him now, but what would happen if that trust faltered? What would happen if war turned the tide? If Italy's grip weakened? If enemies across the ocean still demanded his head? As the late 1930s gave way to the chaos of global war, Vito Genovese stood at the peak of his exile. He was a man who had turned murder into strategy, who had turned narcotics into an empire, who had turned dictatorship into opportunity. But behind the whispers of respect were also whispers of suspicion. How long could he keep walking that line before one side or the other decided he was no longer useful? The answer would come soon enough. And when it did, the fall would be as swift as the rise. Chapter 12, The World at War. The air raid sirens screamed through the night, their hollow wail cutting across the rooftops of Naples. Families scrambled for cover, clutching children, carrying what little they could as the hum of bombers grew louder. The streets shook with explosions, buildings crumbled into dust, and the once grand city seemed to be breaking apart with every passing hour. For most people, the war brought nothing but fear and starvation. But for Vito Genovese, standing in the shadows of his villa, the chaos was not only survival, it was opportunity. World War II had torn Italy open. The fascist government that once held the streets with iron fists now fought desperately to maintain control. Soldiers marched, but supplies ran short. Families starved, but black markets thrived. And into that void stepped men like Vito, men who knew how to turn desperation into profit. For him, the bombs were not obstacles. They were doors. And behind each one lay another chance to expand his power. Black markets during wartime are like underground rivers, hidden, dangerous, but essential. When official channels fail, people turn to the shadows. Bread, oil, medicine, cigarettes, gasoline. Everything became a commodity, and everything had a price. The regime could ration supplies, but Vito could provide them. He moved goods through networks that stretched from Naples to Rome, from small villages to coastal ports. Fishermen became smugglers, shopkeepers became middlemen, soldiers became escorts for shipments hidden under tarps. Vito was at the center, pulling the strings, counting the profits. The people feared him, yes, but they also relied on him. A mother with hungry children could not ask questions about where the flour came from, or why the sugar tasted faintly of seawater. A soldier returning from the front cared little about whether his cigarettes came from state rations or a smuggler's crate. In war, morality bends. Survival becomes the only law. And Vito thrived in that gray space, where rules collapsed and shadows ruled. But his business was not just bread and oil. Drugs still flowed. Heroin and morphine, both essential and illegal, found their way into his hands. Hospitals needed them, addicts craved them, armies traded them. The chaos of war made borders porous, made oversight impossible. Vito used it all. Where others saw shortages, he saw monopolies. Where others saw danger, he saw profit. And then there were the whispers of murder. Mussolini's grip on Italy wavered as the war dragged on, and enemies multiplied. Politicians turned traitor, military officials plotted in secret, citizens resisted in shadows. Many of them ended up dead, their bodies found in alleys, their names crossed off lists. Once again, Vito's name appeared in the rumors. He had the wealth, the muscle, the willingness to do what the regime itself could not be caught doing. To Mussolini's officials, he was a convenient ghost, a man who made problems vanish, but who could never be officially tied to the state. In this darkness, Vito lived like royalty. His villa stood untouched while buildings around it crumbled. His table was set with meals richer than most Italians could dream of during wartime. He entertained guests in silk suits while others wore patched clothes. And yet, in those same rooms, men whispered about who had to disappear next, or what shipment needed protection, or which official could be bought with a stack of cash and a quiet promise. But behind the polished luxury, there was always calculation. Vito knew dictatorships were fickle masters. Mussolini was still in power, but cracks spread across his empire like fractures in glass. Allied bombs rained down. German influence pressed harder. Resistance fighters struck in the night. The war was reshaping Italy, and Vito had to reshape with it. He began spreading his influence across multiple sides. If a fascist official wanted money, Vito gave it. If a German officer wanted goods, Vito provided them. If a black market needed protection, Vito arranged it. He was careful never to commit fully to one camp. To him, ideology was irrelevant. Mussolini's slogans, Hitler's speeches, the resistance's dreams of freedom, none of it mattered. The only banner he served was his own ambition. Yet, the higher he climbed, the sharper the knives around him became. Rivals within the underworld wanted his position. Officials who once relied on him began to see him as a threat. And above it all, the war raged on, unpredictable and unforgiving. Bombs did not care about wealth or power. One lucky strike, and even Vito's empire could turn to rubble. Still, he thrived. Violence remained his guarantee. When rivals whispered too loudly, they vanished. When shipments were threatened, bodies turned up in rivers. In the underworld, war was not chaos. It was a sorting mechanism. The weak fell, the strong endured. And Vito was nothing if not strong. But there were moments, fleeting, quiet moments, when even he must have felt the weight. Walking the streets of Naples, past starving children, past mothers clutching infants, past soldiers dragging themselves home wounded, he would have seen the true cost of the world's madness. Did he feel pity? Perhaps. But pity did not slow his hand. If anything, it hardened him further. In war, there are predators and there are prey. Vito knew which one he was. The Allies drew closer, and Italy trembled under the strain. Mussolini's regime grew desperate, grasping at survival. For Vito, it was both a risk and an opportunity. If the fascists fell, his ties to them could become chains. If the Allies triumphed, he might be branded a traitor. But Vito had survived too many storms to be caught unprepared. He began reaching out through his networks, sending quiet signals, feeling for the direction of the wind. If the tide turned, he would be ready to move with it. And so, in the middle of war, while bombs fell and armies clashed, while entire nations burned, Vito Genovese continued to build his empire. He thrived in the cracks of chaos, turning shortages into smuggling routes, turning fear into leverage, turning war into profit. He had left New York as a fugitive. Now, in a country tearing itself apart, he was more powerful than ever. But power in wartime is never permanent. It is fragile, shifting, always one step from collapse. And as the Allies closed in, as Mussolini's grip weakened, as whispers of betrayal grew louder, one truth became impossible to ignore. The war had given Vito everything, but it could just as easily take it all away. And in the smoke of bombed-out Naples, with sirens wailing in the distance, the question hung in the air like ash. When the dust finally settled, would Vito Genovese still be standing? Chapter 13, U.S. Intelligence and the Mafia. The American warships loomed off the Sicilian coast in the summer of 1943, their decks bristling with soldiers, their guns pointed toward the island like the fingers of a giant. Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily, had begun. It was the opening move in the campaign to topple Mussolini, shatter fascist Italy, and pushed the Axis out of Europe. For ordinary Italians, it meant bombs and blood, foreign armies storming their shores. But for Vito Genovese, watching the chaos unfold, it meant something else. Opportunity. By then, Vito was no stranger to survival. He had weathered Mussolini's fascist state, grown rich on black markets, and tightened his grip on smuggling networks. But the winds of war had shifted. Mussolini was collapsing. German soldiers stalked Italian streets with suspicion in their eyes. And across the ocean, America, Vito's old home, the place he had fled as a fugitive, was preparing to land troops on the very soil he now stood on. To most, it was a nightmare. To Vito, it was a chance to rewrite his story. There were whispers so persistent they have never died, that American intelligence, desperate for allies on the ground in Sicily, reached out to men in New York who had connections across the ocean. Operation Underworld, they called it. A secret pact where the U.S. Navy turned to Mafia figures to secure the docks of New York against sabotage and to pave the way for the invasion of Italy. Men like Lucky Luchiano, still imprisoned in America, were suddenly seen as assets. Their influence stretched into Sicilian villages, into families who had lived under Mafia codes long before fascism ever arrived. And in those whispers, one name kept surfacing: Vito Genovese. The story goes that as the Allies prepared to land, contacts within the Mafia provided maps, intelligence, and guides. Villages that might have resisted instead opened their doors. Fields were cleared, safe passage arranged. The Mafia, once seen as criminals, now became partners in war. The Americans needed order in a land torn apart by dictatorship and poverty, and the Mafia was ready to provide it, at a price. For Vito, the calculus was simple. Mussolini's days were numbered. Hitler's shadow loomed. But even Germany could not hold Italy forever. The Allies were the future, and he intended to stand beside them, not against them. He maneuvered carefully, using his ties to both the underworld and fascist officials to keep himself indispensable. To the Americans, he could pose as an ally. To the Italians, he could pose as a patriot. To himself, he was simply playing the only game he ever trusted: survival. It is said that Vito offered assistance to Allied officers, presenting himself as a useful man who knew the terrain, knew the people, knew how to keep order in places where government had collapsed. He traded favors like currency, easing the transition of power in towns suddenly occupied by foreign soldiers. Was he helping the Allies? Yes, but he was also helping himself, ensuring that when the dust settled, he would not be seen as a traitor to one side or the other. The beauty of Vito's maneuvering was that it was never clear where his loyalty truly lay. To American officers, struggling to distinguish between friend and foe in a land full of shifting allegiances, he was a godsend. To locals, terrified of both fascist police and foreign invaders, he was a mediator. To his own network, he was still the ruthless boss, ensuring that profits continued to flow no matter who carried the flag above city halls. The black market thrived in the shadow of invasion. Allied soldiers carried cigarettes, chocolate, and canned goods, luxuries that starving Italians would pay fortunes for. Vito made sure he was at the center of that trade. Goods stolen from military supplies, diverted shipments, deals struck in whispers between officers and smugglers, it all passed through hands like his. War, to most, was destruction. To Vito, it was commerce. But with every favor he offered, with every connection he exploited, he walked a razor's edge. American intelligence was not naive. They knew they were dealing with criminals, with men who had built empires on blood. Yet the urgency of war blurred those lines. Victory mattered more than morality. If gangsters could deliver results, then gangsters became allies. It was a pact born of necessity, and men like Vito thrived in necessity. Did he help arrange political assassinations for Mussolini before quietly shifting to aid his enemies? Did he use his wealth from narcotics to fund black market trades with Allied officers? Did he whisper to American agents while still bribing Italian officials on the side? The answers remain obscured by history, buried in rumor and sealed files. But what is certain is this: Vito emerged from the war not as a man destroyed by its chaos, but as a man sharpened by it. In villages across southern Italy, Allied soldiers soon learned the unspoken truth. If you wanted order, if you wanted information, if you wanted cooperation, you went to the men of respect, the Mafia. And behind many of those men stood the influence of Vito Genovese. For a fugitive who had once fled America under the shadow of indictment, it was an extraordinary reversal. He was no longer the hunted. He was now, in many ways, the indispensable. To the Allies, to the locals, even to remnants of the fascist state. He was the man who could bridge the gap between chaos and control. But the question lingered like smoke in a ruined street. Could he truly escape his past? America might use him in the shadows, but in the bright light of peace, would they remember him as an ally or drag him back as a criminal? For now, he walked that thin line with the same cold precision that had always defined him. Each deal struck, each favor granted, each whisper passed into the right ear brought him closer to safety. Yet, at the same time, each step tied him deeper into a web of suspicion. The war would end, the bombs would stop, Mussolini would fall, and foreign armies would march into Italy's heart. But when the flags changed and the soldiers went home, what would become of the man who had served them all and betrayed them all in the same breath? Vito Genovese had survived Mussolini. He had survived exile. He had survived the chaos of war by becoming useful to everyone and loyal to no one. But usefulness is temporary. And as the Allies tightened their grip on Italy, the shadow of his past in New York began to stretch across the ocean once more. The war had made him indispensable. But would peace make him disposable? Chapter 14, Arrest in Italy. The heavy boots of American military police echoed down the cracked stone corridors of Naples in the spring of 1944. Outside, the city was choking on its own ruin. Bombed-out buildings leaned like crooked teeth against a gray sky. The war had not ended, but the tide had shifted, and American flags now flew where Mussolini's black banners once draped. Among the rubble, one man lived as though destruction did not touch him, Vito Genovese. He had a mansion, a fleet of cars, a staff of servants. He dined on imported wines while the people outside bartered scraps of bread for cigarettes. To the starving masses, his wealth was obscene. To the American military government trying to bring order, it was suspicious. The arrest came suddenly. One morning, U.S. Army trucks roared into the driveway of Vito's villa. Soldiers stormed past the gates, rifles ready, boots crushing gravel. Inside, Vito appeared calm, almost rehearsed, as if he had always known this moment would come. They found him sitting in a high-backed chair, cigarette in hand, his eyes steady, unreadable. He did not resist. He did not protest. When the officer read out charges of black market profiteering and suspicion of murder, Vito simply nodded. For him, the war was a chessboard, and even a move against him was part of the game. The Americans had been watching him closely. Reports of his activities piled up on the desks of military officials. He had been accused of siphoning off Allied supplies, cigarettes, flour, fuel, selling them on the black market for staggering profits. Soldiers whispered about it openly. Convoys seemed to vanish into thin air. Goods intended for troops ended up in the hands of smugglers. At the heart of the web, investigators claimed, was Vito. To ordinary Italians, the black market was survival. To Vito, it was empire. But theft was not the only stain on his name. There was also blood. In the months before his arrest, an Italian official tasked with investigating corruption had been gunned down. His murder was brazen, committed in broad daylight, a warning carved into the streets. Rumors spread quickly. The man had uncovered evidence pointing directly to Vito's black market empire. And now he was dead. Locals whispered his name behind closed doors, afraid to speak too loudly. To accuse Vito was to invite death. Yet the Americans, unlike frightened villagers, had no intention of letting it pass. The charge of murder was pinned to his name alongside profiteering. For the first time since arriving in Italy, Vito's untouchable facade cracked. Shackled and marched out of his mansion, he was no longer the shadowy broker of survival. He was a prisoner of the very army he had once maneuvered to serve. The trial promised to be explosive. Here was one of the most notorious underworld figures of New York, a fugitive from American justice, arrested on foreign soil during wartime. He was accused not just of bleeding starving civilians dry, but of killing an Italian official in cold blood. The case should have been a triumph for American military justice. It should have ended Vito Genovese's story right there, in a military tribunal in Naples. But the Mafia has always thrived in shadows, and shadows moved swiftly to protect him. When the Americans called witnesses, they disappeared. Men who had sworn affidavits recanted. Others were nowhere to be found. Some were too terrified to testify. A few were found dead. It was as though the entire case had been written on sand, and the tide had washed it away. The murder charge, so bold at first, began to crumble without the voices to back it. The black market accusations suffered the same fate. Soldiers spoke in whispers about bribes, about intimidation, about the silent reach of Vito's hand even from behind bars. The prosecutors pushed forward, but every time they presented evidence, the defense found a way to cloud it in doubt. Receipts vanished. Paper trails ended abruptly. No one could prove, definitively, that Vito himself had ordered the murder or that he had masterminded the siphoning of supplies. Everyone suspected it. No one could pin it down. It was a magician's trick performed in the ruins of a country at war. The crime was visible, but the hand behind it remained hidden. Inside the courtroom, Vito sat with the same calm expression he had worn during his arrest. His dark eyes betrayed nothing. To observers, he seemed almost bored, as if he had seen this play out 100 times before. Perhaps he had. In New York, he had watched witnesses vanish, trials collapse, prosecutors stumble. The war may have changed the landscape, but it had not changed the rules of the game. Intimidation still silenced mouths. Money still changed hands. Fear still bent men's spines. When the verdict came, it was anticlimactic. Without witnesses, without solid evidence, the case dissolved. The charges were dismissed. The Americans had arrested him, yes, but they could not hold him. Vito Genovese walked free, a man who had faced the weight of U.S. military justice during the largest war in history and slipped through its fingers. To the people of Naples, it was confirmation of what they already believed. Vito was untouchable. The Americans, with all their power, had tried to cage him, and he had walked away without so much as a dent in his armor. To the Mafia, it was proof that the old ways still worked. Violence and silence were stronger than any government, stronger even than an occupying army. But beneath the triumph, there was a shadow of danger. The Americans had not forgotten. His name was etched into files, his face stamped into photographs, his crimes noted in reports. He had evaded justice, but not erased suspicion. He was free, but freedom had become fragile. With every step outside the courthouse, with every breath of Naples' smoldering air, Vito knew the eyes of the Allies still followed him. For Vito himself, it was not relief that filled him when the charges were dropped. It was something colder. He had learned once again that survival demanded not just cunning, but ruthlessness. His enemies in Italy had been silenced one way or another. His enemies in America still waited. The war had shielded him for now, providing chaos and cover. But what would happen when the guns stopped, when the soldiers went home, when law and order returned with full force? The people he manipulated, the governments he deceived, the soldiers he bribed, they might vanish like the witnesses in his trial. But memories do not vanish. And across the ocean, in the very country he once fled, prosecutors still remembered the name Vito Genovese. The arrest in Italy should have ended him. Instead, it hardened him. It proved that even in the face of armies, he could bend the world to his will. But it also foreshadowed something darker. The Americans had tried once. They would try again. And one day, the shadows he commanded might not be enough to protect him. For now, Vito walked free through a ruined city, a man draped in fine suits while the people around him starved. A man who had killed suspicion, but not truth. The sound of military trucks echoed in the distance, a reminder that war was not yet finished. But Vito knew something more dangerous than war itself was waiting for him. The end of chaos, the return of order, and with it, the long reach of justice he had once escaped. And though he smiled as he left the courthouse, there was an unease in the air, like thunder rolling in the distance. He had survived again. But how many times could a man cheat fate before it finally caught up? Chapter 15. Back to New York. The steamship cut through the Atlantic like a blade, its hull carrying soldiers, businessmen, and exiles back to the shores of America. Among them was a man who walked the deck with quiet certainty, his gaze fixed westward, toward a skyline he had once ruled from the shadows. Vito Genovese was coming home. It was 1946. The war was over. Cities across Europe lay in rubble, but New York stood tall, glittering, alive with money and opportunity. For a man like Vito, it was the perfect stage to begin again. But his return was not simply a homecoming. It was a resurrection. Back in Italy, he had flirted with ruin, arrested, accused, nearly caged by the Americans. Yet once again he had slipped away, walking free while witnesses vanished into silence or into graves. Now, as the ship neared the harbor, he knew that his greatest gamble was still ahead. He would have to reclaim what was his, to rebuild his empire from the ashes of absence. And in the streets of New York, absence was weakness. Others had circled his old territories like vultures. Old allies had grown cautious. Enemies had grown bold. To step back into the city was to step back into a war. The first shock came the moment his feet touched American soil. New York had changed. The skyline was taller. The neighborhoods more crowded. The soldiers who had survived Europe and the Pacific had returned, filling the bars, the union halls, the factories. Money flowed like a river, fueled by victory, by industry, by a nation suddenly aware of its power. But beneath the surface, nothing had changed at all. The Mafia still thrived, quietly feeding on labor rackets, gambling, and narcotics. The bosses who had survived the war years still carved the city like a feast, each guarding his peace with sharp knives. Vito was determined to take back his seat at the table. The commission, that secret council of families born out of Lucky Luchiano's vision, still ruled as the invisible government of organized crime. But its members eyed Vito warily. He had left under a cloud of suspicion, fleeing justice when the heat grew too strong. To some, he was a fugitive crawling back after exile. To others, he was a dangerous rival who might upset the balance they had maintained. Vito knew he could not simply demand power. He would have to prove he still belonged, that he was stronger, smarter, more ruthless than ever before. He began by reaching out to old allies, men who remembered him not as an exile, but as a trusted lieutenant of Luchiano. Some greeted him warmly, others with hesitation. Trust in the underworld was like smoke, thick in the moment, gone with the wind. But Vito carried himself with the quiet authority of a man who had never truly been dethroned. In smoky back rooms and dimly lit clubs, he reminded them of favors owed, of debts unpaid, of promises made when his star was still burning bright. Slowly, piece by piece, he began stitching his network back together. But his return was not without resistance. Territories he once controlled had been divided among men who had grown fat on his absence. To them, his return was not the homecoming of a brother but the intrusion of a ghost. They whispered that he was reckless, that his ties to Mussolini and the black markets of Italy made him too dangerous, too unpredictable. Some plotted quietly against him, hoping to cut him down before he could rise again. Vito knew their whispers. He welcomed them. Fear was a currency he spent wisely. He moved swiftly, reclaiming rackets with surgical precision. Gambling dens that once answered to him were reminded of old loyalties. Union bosses felt the weight of his influence settle back onto their shoulders. And behind it all, he saw the future not in dice games or card tables, but in the narcotics trade. Heroin had become the new gold, flowing through secret ports, hidden in cargo, spreading across the veins of New York like wildfire. Vito understood what few others did, that drugs were not just another business. They were a fortune waiting to be harvested. If he could command that trade, his empire would eclipse even the legends of the past. But ambition carried a price. Reconnecting with old allies meant rekindling old rivalries. Men who had been content with their small kingdoms during his absence bristled at his return. They feared the shadow he cast over them. Every meeting became a test. Every handshake carried the weight of suspicion. Was Vito there to rebuild or to conquer? To many, it felt like both. At night, in his quiet moments, Vito must have known the fragility of it all. The war had given him cover, but America was not Italy. Here, witnesses did not vanish so easily. Prosecutors were sharpening their knives, federal agents rebuilding files that had once gathered dust. He had evaded justice across the ocean, but in New York, his name was still poison to investigators. They remembered him. They had not forgotten. And though they could not yet touch him, he knew they would try again. Yet Vito lived for such tension. Power to him was not peace. It was war without end. And in 1946, New York was his battlefield once more. One evening, as he sat in a restaurant tucked into Little Italy, sipping red wine while the city's hum bled through the windows, he was reminded of just how precarious his resurrection was. Across the table, an old associate leaned in, voice low, warning him of plots, of whispers in back alleys that men were already conspiring to push him out, to bury him before he could regain his throne. Vito listened, nodding slowly, as if he had already calculated every move. He smiled faintly, a smile that did not reach his eyes, and poured another glass of wine. For him, enemies were not obstacles. They were opportunities. The truth was simple. Vito Genovese had returned not just to survive, but to dominate. And the city, whether it liked it or not, would have to make room for him. But the question loomed over every move he made, every meeting he attended, every step he took back into the world he once ruled. How long could he balance on the edge of survival? He had cheated fate in Italy, walked free from the hands of the American military, returned to a city that still remembered his crimes. He was building again, stronger, richer, hungrier than before. Yet fate has a way of keeping score. And in the underworld of New York, scores were settled in blood. Vito Genovese was back. His empire was rising again. But even as he built his house of power brick by brick, the ground beneath him was already beginning to shake. Would the commission accept him fully back into their fold? Or would they one day decide that the ghost of exile was too dangerous to let live? The answer, as always in Vito's world, would come not in words, but in the silence after the gunfire. And so, in 1946, with the city buzzing with victory and ambition, Vito Genovese walked the streets of New York once more. He had returned. He had reclaimed. But the war for power was only beginning. And somewhere, unseen, fate was waiting for its turn to strike. Chapter 16, Rivalry with Frank Costello. The room was quiet except for the clink of ice in a glass. Frank Costello sat at the head of the table, his voice calm, steady, reassuring, as if he were the president of a corporation rather than the acting boss of the most powerful crime family in America. Around him, men leaned in, listening closely. Costello was not a man who roared. He was not a man who threatened. He governed with persuasion, with influence, with the kind of soft power that politicians respected and rivals underestimated. It was why they called him the Prime Minister. But in the back of that room, silent and watchful, Vito Genovese studied him like a wolf watching prey that didn't yet know it was being stalked. It was 1946, and lucky Luchiano's empire still bore his name, even though Luchiano himself was living in exile in Italy, banished by the government that feared his reach. In his absence, Costello had stepped into the role of acting boss, steering the family with his political ties, his gambling operations, and his uncanny ability to keep peace among men who were born for war. Costello thrived in diplomacy. He thrived in balance. But balance was not what Vito Genovese wanted. Vito had returned from Italy with hunger in his bones. He had seen the war, lived through the chaos, made fortunes in the black market while soldiers starved. He believed fate had spared him for something greater, that he was destined not to serve, not to wait, but to rule. And in his eyes, Frank Costello was a caretaker, a placeholder keeping the throne warm until the rightful king returned. Vito had no patience for compromise. He had no respect for Costello's style of rule. He wanted absolute control and nothing less. The rivalry began quietly, like cracks in ice. In meetings, Vito questioned decisions, challenging Costello with sharp words disguised as suggestions. He reminded others of Luchiano's old ways, of the days when muscle mattered more than politics, when fear carried more weight than a handshake with a senator. Costello, calm and deliberate, countered with reason. He argued that power wasn't just taken in the streets anymore. It was negotiated in boardrooms, in government offices, in smoky backrooms with judges and lawmakers. But every time Costello spoke of alliances and influence, Vito heard weakness. To him, Costello's diplomacy was a leash, and men like Vito did not wear leashes. Among the ranks, whispers grew louder. Soldiers and capos weighed the two men in their minds like gamblers weighing odds. Costello offered stability, safety, a way to thrive without drawing too much heat. Vito offered ambition, raw power, the promise of glory and dominance. Some feared him. Some respected him. Many remembered his ruthlessness. Loyalty in the Mafia was a fragile thing, easily bent by fear or greed. And Vito knew how to play both. One evening, in a smoky restaurant tucked in Midtown, a capo leaned across a table and warned Costello that Vito was building his own faction, quietly pulling men into his orbit. The warning was not a surprise. Costello had felt it for months. The shift in energy, the way certain eyes followed Vito with admiration or fear. He knew that Genovese was not a man who settled for second place. He had been waiting for this challenge. And yet, when the warning came, Costello only lit a cigarette, his hand steady, his expression unreadable. He understood the game. He had been playing it his whole life. But the game with Vito was different. It wasn't about business. It was personal. Vito saw Costello as soft. He mocked his reliance on politicians, sneered at his taste for respectability. To Vito, Costello's alliances with judges and mayors made him less of a gangster, almost a businessman. And while Costello saw that as the future, Vito saw it as betrayal. To him, the underworld was meant to be ruled with fear, with iron, with the certainty that no one could challenge the throne without paying in blood. The tension between them played out in shadows, but the city felt it. Meetings grew colder. Men who once laughed together now measured every word, careful not to be seen choosing sides. The commission, that fragile balance of bosses, watched with wary eyes. A war between Costello and Genovese could shatter the peace they had built since the bloody days of the Castellamarese War. They remembered too well what happened when ambition spilled unchecked into the streets. Still, Vito pressed forward. He began to carve out pieces of the family for himself, setting up his own gambling operations, moving deeper into narcotics, quietly shifting money and soldiers under his control. Costello, unwilling to ignite a civil war, tolerated more than most men would. He thought patience could contain Vito, that diplomacy could cool his fire. But every inch Costello gave, Vito took his weakness. It was a slow-motion collision. Two men, two visions, moving toward each other, each convinced the other was unfit to lead. In moments of quiet, Costello's confidence cracked. He confided in trusted allies that Vito was dangerous, unpredictable, a man who could burn the family down just to build it again in his own image. He knew Vito's history, the blood he had spilled, the cold certainty in his eyes. And yet Costello also knew that he was not a man of violence. His strength was in words, not guns. That strength had carried him this far. But against Vito, would it be enough? Meanwhile, Vito sharpened his blade. He whispered to soldiers that Costello was weak, that his time had passed, that real power was not in courts and city hall, but in the streets, in the unions, in the ports where money moved in crates and barrels. He promised them more profits, more strength, more respect. He painted Costello as an old politician clinging to relevance while the world moved on. And for men who lived and died by profit, ambition was a powerful lure. The stage was being set for a storm. In 1947, the rivalry reached a breaking point. Rumors swirled that Vito was not just plotting to undermine Costello. He was plotting to replace him entirely, to seize control of the family and claim the throne for himself. Costello heard the whispers, felt the knives being sharpened in the dark. He knew what was coming. but he refused to strike first. For him, violence was always the last resort, the mark of desperation. But for Vito, violence was simply a tool, as natural as breathing. In the dim light of those years, the family split into shadows. Men chose sides carefully, knowing that one wrong step could cost them their lives. Every meeting carried the weight of betrayal. Every handshake might be the last. And as the city hummed with post-war prosperity, the underworld braced for conflict. The rivalry between Frank Costello and Vito Genovese was more than a struggle for power. It was a clash of philosophies, two visions of what the Mafia should be. Costello believed in subtlety, in political clout, in making the underworld invisible by weaving it into the fabric of society. Vito believed in fear, in dominance, in an empire carved from blood and loyalty. One sought legitimacy, the other demanded obedience. The tension could not last forever. Something had to give. Late one night, as Vito sat in his study, surrounded by the quiet hum of the city outside his window, he leaned back in his chair and whispered to a trusted associate. The time had come, he said. The family needed new leadership. Costello had ruled long enough. The throne was waiting. And in that whispered promise, the storm broke. From that moment on, the path was set. Vito would not rest until Frank Costello was out of the way. The question was not if. It was when. And in the dark alleys of New York, men began to prepare for the inevitable, the day the wolf would finally bare his teeth. Would Costello's calm hand and political power protect him? Or would Vito Genovese, ruthless and relentless, finally claim the crown he believed was his by right? The city held its breath, waiting for the answer. And in the silence, the shadow of war stretched longer, darker, across the empire Luchiano had built. The storm between Costello and Genovese had begun. Chapter 17, Narcotics Pipeline. The first shipment slid into New York hidden in barrels of olive oil. No one in customs knew that beneath the sheen of imported goods, carefully wrapped in wax paper and sealed against moisture, lay bricks of heroin, white powder worth millions. In that moment, the world of organized crime changed forever. It was not just smuggling anymore. It was not gambling, racketeering, or unions. It was poison, pure and refined, flowing through ports and streets like a river no one could dam. And behind it all was Vito Genovese, the man who believed narcotics were not just business, they were destiny. Vito had watched the world shift after the war. Soldiers came home broken, civilians numbed their pain with anything they could find, and new generations flirted with the thrill of escape. Where others saw chaos, Vito saw demand. To him, narcotics were not a vice to be feared but a market to be owned. He was not the first to dabble in drugs. Street gangs and small-time dealers had moved powders and pills for decades, but Vito was the first to see it as empire building. The system he built stretched across oceans. Turkish farmers grew poppies in fields that swayed like crimson seas. In France, chemists turned raw opium into morphine, and then into heroin, processing it in secret labs hidden behind the fronts of bakeries and warehouses. Ships carried the shipments through the Mediterranean, through Italy, through the ports of Marseilles. And from there, they flowed into New York, tucked into crates, barrels, and luggage. It became known as the French Connection, though in truth it was a web, sprawling, intricate, invisible. Vito was its architect. He believed heroin was the future, the commodity that could outpace gambling, liquor, and unions combined. He treated it like oil in the ground, a resource to be mined, refined, and sold at a price that turned pennies into fortunes. But the trade was not just about money. It was about control. Drugs created dependency, and dependency created power. For every addict on a corner, for every dealer in a tenement, there was a chain that led upward, tightening around the hands of men like Vito. Not everyone agreed. Old guard bosses like Frank Costello despised narcotics. They saw heroin as heat, a magnet for law enforcement, a dirty business that drew too much blood. Costello believed in gambling dens, in policy rackets, in influence. He believed narcotics would drag them all down. But Vito laughed at such thinking. To him, Costello was clinging to the past. The real future was in the veins of addicts, in the trembling hands of those who would pay any price for another taste. It was a cruel vision, but it was profitable. By the late 1940s and into the early 50s, Vito's pipeline was gushing. Money poured in faster than it could be laundered. Entire neighborhoods in Harlem, Brooklyn, and the Bronx became markets, their streets transformed into open-air pharmacies run by soldiers loyal to Vito's command. He fed product into them like coal into a furnace, and the city burned with it. For the men running the operation, fear was constant. Customs agents could crack a shipment. Federal agents could flip a low-level mule. One mistake could unravel the chain. Yet Vito thrived in this fear. He understood that risk magnified reward. To his mind, if others were too scared to touch narcotics, then all the better. He would own the market alone. The addicts told a different story. They stumbled through alleys, their lives hollowed out, their families shattered. Mothers wept over sons who pawned everything for another fix. Fathers cursed names they did not know but felt in the air like a curse. And above it all, Vito counted profits. He saw human weakness as another resource to exploit. Still, even Vito knew heroin was a dangerous flame to play with. He shielded himself with layers of cutouts, dealers who never knew the source, smugglers who never saw the bosses, lieutenants who never asked too many questions. The supply chain was a maze, designed so that if one corridor collapsed, the others still flowed. Like a river split into countless tributaries, it always found its way to the sea. The law was not blind. Narcotics squads were forming, federal agents began watching docks more closely, and whispers of the Mafia's growing role reached Washington. Yet proof was hard to come by. Shipments vanished into warehouses before officers knew where to look. Witnesses disappeared, either bought or buried. And every time a case neared Vito's name, it collapsed under the weight of missing testimony and frightened silence. Inside the Mafia itself, Vito's empire stirred resentment. Men like Joe Bonanno and even Carlo Gambino hesitated to embrace narcotics fully, fearing the federal attention it would bring. But Vito was persuasive. He painted heroin as the ultimate equalizer, a business that could dwarf every other racket combined. He reminded them that politicians could shut down gambling halls, police could raid unions, but narcotics would never run out of customers. The product sold itself. His ambition turned whispers into shouts. By 1950, Vito was no longer just a rival to Frank Costello. He was the shadow looming over the entire commission. With narcotics money, he had resources to buy loyalty, to fund soldiers, to grease palms. Every dollar that dripped into his pockets from the French connection was another step closer to the crown. But the crown came with a curse. The narcotics pipeline was too vast, too profitable, to stay hidden forever. Undercover agents began to infiltrate low-level rings. Newspapers printed stories of heroin flooding city streets. Politicians raged about the epidemic destroying youth. And with every headline, the Mafia's name became harder to keep out of the public eye. For Costello, this was proof of his warnings. He urged restraint, tried to argue that narcotics would bring nothing but disaster. But by then, Vito's network was already entrenched. It was no longer just a business. It was the backbone of his empire. To dismantle it would mean dismantling himself. And so, he pressed on, even as the walls crept closer. At night, in dimly lit bars and smoke-filled backrooms, his lieutenants whispered of fortunes beyond imagination. A single kilo of heroin, bought cheaply overseas, could be sold in New York for 50 times the price. Shipments that cost tens of thousands turned into millions. It was alchemy, turning powder into gold, suffering into profit. And every man who touched it was bound tighter to Vito. For once you tasted profits like that, there was no going back. The narcotics pipeline was not just smuggling. It was a chain of loyalty, fear, and greed. It was the artery that kept Vito's ambition alive. But like any artery, if severed, it could bleed him out in an instant. In the early 50s, federal agents came closer than ever. Raids struck parts of the pipeline. Dealers were rounded up, heroin seized, names whispered in interrogation rooms. But like a magician, Vito always disappeared behind the smoke. Every time the law reached for him, The trail broke. Witnesses recanted, evidence vanished, cases dissolved. To his enemies, it seemed almost supernatural. To his allies, it was proof of his genius. Yet even genius has blind spots. For every addict who stumbled through the streets, for every family torn apart, the public's anger grew louder. Politicians demanded action. Law enforcement sharpened its focus. And inside the Mafia, bosses muttered that Vito's hunger might drag them all into a war they could not win. Still, Vito pressed forward. He believed the empire he was building would outlast them all. He imagined himself not just as a boss, but as a king, presiding over an international trade that no law could stop. But ambition is a fire that consumes as much as it illuminates. And in the shadows of New York, in the corridors of Washington, and in the whispers of rival bosses, that fire was attracting eyes that would not look away. Vito Genovese had built his empire on heroin, threading veins of poison through the heart of America. The question was no longer whether he could hold it. The question was when, and how violently, it would all collapse. Chapter 18. The Attempt on Costello. The sound came sharp and violent, echoing through the quiet lobby of a Manhattan apartment building. One single gunshot, fired at close range, ripping through the calm like a thunderclap in the night. The target was Frank Costello, the man who had once ruled the underworld with an iron grip and a politician's smile. The gunman was Vincent Chin Gigante, a young soldier loyal to Vito Genovese. In that instant, the decades-long balance of power tilted. The question was not just whether Costello would live or die. It was whether the future of the American Mafia would change forever. For years, Genovese had lived in Costello's shadow. Frank was considered the prime minister of the underworld, the man who made deals with senators, who dined with judges, who could influence elections with a phone call. He had cultivated respectability, the image of a gentleman gangster, one foot in crime and the other in politics. To many, he was untouchable. But to Vito, he was simply an obstacle. And obstacles, in Vito's world, were meant to be removed. The plot was hatched in whispers, in backrooms thick with smoke, over glasses of whiskey that never seemed to empty. Vito had grown tired of waiting. His narcotics empire was expanding, his soldiers were loyal, and his ambition was burning too hot to contain. Costello still held the official title of boss, but his power had weakened. The commission was fractured, alliances shifting, and men who had once pledged loyalty to Costello were now hedging their bets, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. Vito decided he would not wait for the wind. He would create the storm himself. Vincent Chin Gigante was chosen as the weapon. Young, unpredictable, but fiercely loyal to Vito, he carried himself with a strange mix of insecurity and menace. He was not yet the eccentric figure he would later become, wandering the streets in bathrobes to feign madness. In 1957, he was a soldier with something to prove, a man willing to pull the trigger to please his master. The night of the attack, Frank Costello returned to his Manhattan home, unaware that death was waiting just outside. The city was alive with its usual rhythm, horns blaring, neon lights humming, footsteps echoing on wet sidewalks. Costello, tired from the day, carried himself with the posture of a man who had long learned to mask fear. For decades, he had played the game of survival, dodging indictments, outmaneuvering rivals, and projecting an air of calm even when the knives were out. But that night, calm was not enough. As he stepped into the lobby, Chin emerged. He raised the gun with trembling hands, his finger tightening around the trigger. The weapon spat fire. The bullet struck Costello in the head, grazing his skull just above the ear. He staggered, dazed, his hand instinctively reaching for the wound. Blood trickled between his fingers. The lobby spun around him, the world collapsing into a single moment of shock and pain. Chin froze. The shot had not killed him. It had only wounded him. For a heartbeat, hesitation filled the air, heavy and suffocating. Then, instead of finishing the job, Chin fled, his footsteps pounding against the pavement as he vanished into the night. Frank Costello did not fall. He did not die. He survived the attempt, walking away with a scar instead of a coffin. To outsiders, it was a miracle. To insiders, it was a message. The bullet was not just an act of violence. It was a declaration. Vito Genovese had made his move. When questioned later, Costello, still bleeding from his head, offered only a few quiet words. "I got my answer." He understood perfectly. The message had been received. In the underworld, survival was not always about bullets. Sometimes it was about reading the writing on the wall. Costello could feel the tide turning. His soldiers were restless, his influence waning. He had always prided himself on being rational, pragmatic, a man who knew when to fight and when to yield. And now, after staring death in the face, he knew it was time to yield. He stepped down, effectively handing the reins of power to Vito Genovese. It was victory for Vito, though not without shadows. The assassination attempt had been sloppy, too obvious, too loud. Law enforcement saw it as proof that the Mafia's internal wars were spilling into the streets. Newspapers plastered headlines about the shooting, painting the Mafia as a growing menace. The very public nature of the act drew heat from every direction. But to Vito, the risk was worth the reward. Costello was finished, and Vito's path to the throne was clear. For Chin, the botched job carried its own burden. Though he had failed to kill, he had succeeded in terrifying. In the strange logic of the Mafia, sometimes fear was as effective as death. His loyalty to Vito remained unquestioned, and his reputation began to grow. Yet, behind closed doors, there were whispers about whether the young hitman had deliberately spared Costello, or whether fear had stayed his hand. Only Chin knew the truth, and he never spoke of it. The commission reacted with unease. A boss had nearly been assassinated, not by rivals from another family, but by a man within his own ranks. It was a dangerous precedent. If the Mafia was built on respect and order, then this was a crack in the foundation. Some bosses worried that Genovese was too ambitious, too reckless. But others saw strength in his boldness. In their world, power was rarely surrendered, it was taken. And Vito had taken it. Costello retreated into a quieter life. He was not humiliated, nor was he forgotten. He still carried influence, still had allies, still commanded respect in certain circles. But he no longer sought to rule. He had seen what ambition brought: blood, betrayal, and a bullet to the head. In his retreat, there was wisdom. In Vito's rise, there was hunger. The balance of power in New York shifted. With Costello out of the way, Vito now had the Luchiano family firmly in his grasp. It would no longer be Costello's family, nor Luchiano's. It would be his, the Genovese family. The narcotics empire he had built, the alliances he had forged, and the ruthless ambition he carried would now find their full expression. Yet even as Vito celebrated, storm clouds gathered. The shooting had awakened law enforcement in a way no gambling racket or union scam ever could. Politicians, already wary of the Mafia's reach, now demanded action. Federal agents began compiling dossiers, digging deeper, looking for cracks in the armor. The bullet meant for Costello had ricocheted beyond its target. It had struck the attention of the entire nation. Still, in 1957, the underworld belonged to Vito Genovese. He had clawed his way from exile in Italy to the throne of New York. He had outlasted rivals, orchestrated murders, built an empire on heroin, and now toppled the man once thought untouchable. He stood at the pinnacle of power, crowned in shadows. But crowns in the Mafia were heavy, and they rarely stayed secure for long. The attempt on Costello had given Vito what he wanted: the title, the fear, the recognition. But it had also painted a target on his back larger than any he had ever known. Rivals watched him closely. Allies whispered behind his back, and law enforcement sharpened its knives. The question was no longer whether Vito Genovese could rise. He had risen. The question now was whether he could hold the throne, or whether the same violence he unleashed would one day circle back to him. The night of the shooting ended with Costello alive, Genovese in power, and the Mafia on the brink of transformation. The streets of New York buzzed with rumors. The commission sat uneasy, and every man who played the game understood that the rules had changed. The attempt on Costello was not the end of the war. It was only the beginning. And as Vito tightened his grip on the underworld, he could not yet see the next move. a move that would drag him into a spotlight brighter and deadlier than he ever imagined. Chapter 19: The Apalachin Summit. The air was crisp in upstate New York, the kind of November cold that nipped at the skin and warned of winter's approach. In the small, sleepy town of Apalachin, life moved quietly, almost invisibly, as if untouched by the chaos of the world beyond its borders. But on one particular day in 1957, this quiet place became the stage for one of the most humiliating moments in Mafia history. Cars lined the driveway of a country estate, sleek Cadillacs and Buicks crowding the gravel road, their polished chrome catching the pale sun. Inside the house and across its grounds gathered the most powerful crime bosses in America. It was meant to be a coronation for Vito Genovese, a summit of power to seal his reign. Instead, it became the moment the underworld could no longer pretend it didn't exist. The meeting was Vito's idea. He had finally toppled Frank Costello and claimed the title of boss. But a crown in the Mafia was never secure. To hold it, you needed recognition from others who wore their own crowns. Vito wanted more than New York. He wanted the nation. He wanted bosses from Chicago, Buffalo, Detroit, Cleveland, and beyond to bend the knee, or at least nod in his direction. It was a show of strength, a gathering designed to remind everyone who had risen to the top. But in his hunger, Vito miscalculated. He forgot that the very thing that made the Mafia so powerful, its invisibility, was fragile. He believed he could bring dozens of bosses together in one rural home without notice. He believed secrecy could stretch that far. He believed wrong. The host was Joseph Barber, a soft-spoken boss with a sprawling estate perfect for such a gathering. On the surface, Barber looked like any other successful businessman: factory owner, community figure, family man. Beneath the veneer, he was part of the underworld's architecture, and his home would serve as neutral ground. Vito envisioned the summit as a congress of kings. They would feast, discuss, and align themselves under his vision for a new Mafia order. The guests arrived in style, convoys of expensive cars driving down narrow country roads that normally saw only farmers and delivery trucks. Local residents noticed. They saw license plates from out of state. They saw men in sharp suits stepping out, men who looked too polished, too guarded, too serious for such a sleepy town. Suspicion stirred. It didn't take long for the police to pay attention. Ed Croswell, a sharp-eyed state trooper, had already suspected Barber of connections to organized crime. Seeing dozens of luxury cars gathering at the estate set off alarm bells. Croswell wasn't intimidated by reputations. He saw an opportunity. Soon, officers set up roadblocks, watching the grand procession of crime's elite with mounting astonishment. It was as if the invisible empire had chosen to walk straight into the open. Inside, the atmosphere was different. The bosses gathered in clusters, their voices low, their eyes sharp. Men who ruled cities, who commanded armies of criminals, stood shoulder to shoulder, some greeting each other with warmth, others with suspicion. Conversations buzzed about territory, narcotics, gambling, alliances, and disputes. To outsiders, it might have looked like a simple gathering, a banquet of old friends. To insiders, it was history in motion, a mafia parliament, where power was negotiated in whispers and sealed with handshakes. Vito moved among them with the air of a man who believed the throne was his. His gestures carried authority, his voice carried weight. Every nod in his direction, every agreement made, was fuel for his ambition. This summit, he believed, would cement his place not only as boss of the Luchiano family, now renamed for him, but as the closest thing to a national leader the Mafia had ever seen. But outside, the police closed in. Officers moved toward the estate, setting up checkpoints, cutting off exits. What began as a gathering of kings was about to turn into a trap. The raid, when it came, was chaos. Officers swarmed, blocking roads, stopping cars, demanding answers. Men who were accustomed to commanding fear now scrambled like cornered prey. Expensive shoes slipped on wet grass as bosses ran through fields, desperate to escape. Some tore through fences, ruining suits worth a fortune. Others dove into bushes, crouching low, praying not to be caught. The image of untouchable power dissolved in an instant, replaced by the sight of middle-aged men running for their freedom like petty criminals. Inside the estate, panic spread. Word came that police were everywhere. Men shoved food aside, knocked over glasses, rushed for the doors. It wasn't just the threat of arrest, it was the humiliation. To be caught like this, exposed in broad daylight, was a nightmare. Some bosses were captured, questioned, and released. Others managed to flee into the woods. A few, unlucky and clumsy, were caught on the spot, taken in for questioning by police who could scarcely believe the scale of the catch. In the end, over 60 men were detained, though few charges stuck. The Mafia's lawyers were skilled, and silence was a code few dared to break. Yet the damage was done. The Apalachin Summit, meant to showcase Vito's dominance, instead revealed the Mafia to the nation. Newspapers exploded with headlines. Photographs showed powerful men sweating, stumbling, humiliated. Politicians seized on the moment, pointing to the gathering as undeniable proof of a nationwide criminal conspiracy. For decades, the government had downplayed the Mafia's existence. Now, they could not ignore it. The veil had been torn away. For Vito, it was a disaster hidden beneath a veneer of victory. On the surface, he had gathered the bosses, and many had shown deference. But the raid made him look reckless. His attempt at a coronation had instead dragged the Mafia into the brightest spotlight it had ever faced. The FBI, long dismissive, began to prioritize organized crime. The summit had shaken the very foundation of secrecy that the Mafia depended on. Within the families, whispers spread. Some accused Vito of arrogance, of risking too much for his ego. Others wondered if his leadership would bring more heat than power. A boss was supposed to protect the organization, not parade it before the world. The men who had fled through the fields would never forget the sting of that humiliation. Proud dons, reduced to stumbling through mud, chased by local cops. It was an image that clung to them, a reminder that their power, no matter how vast, could be mocked and dismantled in an instant. In New York, the fallout rippled. Law enforcement ramped up investigations. Wiretaps, surveillance, and informants began to multiply. The Mafia, once invisible, was now under constant scrutiny. Every move was watched, every meeting shadowed. The summit had turned the tide of law enforcement, sparking an era where the government would no longer look the other way. And Vito, for all his ambition, had given them the perfect excuse. He still held power, still controlled his family, still commanded respect through fear. But his enemies, both inside and outside the underworld, now had a weapon. They could point to Apalachin and say, "This is what Vito brings: heat, humiliation, exposure." For men who lived in shadows, exposure was poison. That night, as the estate emptied, the fields trampled and muddy from the panicked escape, the quiet of Apalachin returned. The town would never forget what it had seen. Neither would the Mafia. What was supposed to be a display of unity became the greatest embarrassment in its history. The bosses licked their wounds. Vito basked in his temporary triumph, but could not silence the doubts. Power had come at a price, and he had yet to realize how steep it would be. The Apalachin Summit was not just a raid. It was a crack in the foundation, one that would widen with time, exposing secrets, eroding strength, and leading Vito toward a downfall he could not yet imagine. For now, he believed he had won. But the shadow of Apalachin would follow him everywhere, a reminder that even kings can be humiliated. And as law enforcement sharpened its focus, one question lingered in every whispered conversation. Had Vito's grab for glory doomed them all? Chapter 20, Boss of Bosses. The image of suited men running through muddy fields in Apalachin still lingered in newspapers and whispered jokes. But behind those humiliating headlines, something very different was taking shape. In the smoke-filled backrooms of New York, behind guarded doors, and within whispered conversations, Vito Genovese was being acknowledged in a way that mattered far more than the ridicule of the press. Despite the disaster in upstate New York, he was now seen, in hushed tones and cautious nods, as the most powerful mob boss in America. The man who had toppled Frank Costello. The man who had survived deportation, exile, and federal scrutiny. The man who now carried a new, dangerous title, Boss of Bosses. The phrase was never official, never written into the Mafia's invisible constitution. In truth, it was dangerous even to speak it. The Mafia had been designed to avoid monarchies, to prevent any single man from claiming the throne over all others. Each family had its boss, each city its hierarchy. But power has a way of bending rules, and fear has a way of silencing objections. When Vito walked into a room, the room bent toward him. His reputation was enough to crush dissent before it formed. Even his enemies were forced to admit, at least privately, that he now stood at the top of the pyramid. What made Vito so terrifying was not just his position, but his nature. He did not rule like a politician, with charm or diplomacy. He ruled like a general. Where Frank Costello had preferred influence, connections, and bribes slipped to senators and judges, Vito preferred the iron hand. He was blunt. He was ruthless. He believed respect could only be bought in blood. And so, fear became his greatest currency. At night, in smoky clubs across New York, men whispered about him. Some with respect, others with resentment, most with caution. It was said that if Vito felt slighted, a man's life could unravel in hours. He could sit in silence at a table, his thick fingers drumming against a glass, and the weight of his presence alone would choke the air. To challenge him was to invite a sentence you never heard announced. But power is never simply about violence. It is about reach. And Vito's reach now stretched across oceans. His narcotics pipeline, carefully built in the shadows, was the backbone of his empire. Heroin refined in Italy found its way into the ports of New York, then flowed into neighborhoods, spreading addiction like a quiet plague. Money poured in, mountains of it. Enough to grease palms, buy loyalty, and fuel an empire that dwarfed the rackets of gambling or bootlegging from decades earlier. He had taken what was once a sideline business and transformed it into a global operation. For that, he was not just feared, he was envied. Still, Apalachin left scars. The raid had dragged the Mafia into the light, and law enforcement had finally woken up to the scale of organized crime. FBI agents now followed, tapped phones, shadowed meetings. The press printed names once kept hidden. Some bosses worried the heat would scorch them all. But here was the paradox. Even as law enforcement attention grew, Vito's influence solidified. Fear made men close ranks. In the aftermath of chaos, they turned toward the man who seemed strong enough to weather the storm. And that man was Vito. Yet strength like his came with enemies. Some whispered that he was reckless, that his arrogance would bring ruin. Others saw opportunity in his dominance, waiting for a crack to appear. In a world built on betrayal and survival, power was never permanent. The very title of Boss of Bosses was both crown and curse, a target painted across his chest. But Vito was not a man to shy away from crowns or curses. He leaned into them. At meetings, his voice carried over others, commanding silence with the force of inevitability. Men who once followed Frank Costello now bent toward Vito, not out of love, but out of necessity. A lion did not need to be loved to rule the savannah. He only needed to be feared. And Vito relished that fear. He had clawed his way back from exile, from disgrace, from whispers that he was finished. Now, he stood at the height of power, his name spoken with both awe and dread. He wore the role of Boss of Bosses not as a title, but as a natural state. Still, beneath the swagger, there was unease. The summit at Apalachin had not only humiliated the Mafia, it had marked a turning point. The government now had a name for the thing it once denied, a national criminal syndicate. And they would not rest until they dismantled it. Vito could silence rivals, but he could not silence the relentless march of investigators. Each phone call, each meeting, each whispered conversation carried the risk of exposure. But for now, he stood tall. He had overcome Frank Costello, marginalized Carlo Gambino, and pulled Joseph Prophesy into his orbit. Even men from Chicago, where Al Capone's ghost still lingered, acknowledged his supremacy. The commission, the governing council of the Mafia, had shifted under his weight. Vito Genovese had become the gravitational force no one could ignore. Power, though, is never still. It demands constant proof. Each day brought new challenges, new betrayals to anticipate, new fires to smother. And with each victory, Vito grew bolder, his confidence hardening into hubris. He did not merely want to be first among equals. He wanted the equals to disappear. In dimly lit restaurants, at the backs of bars, over tables where glasses of wine sweated under the glow of single bulbs, men discussed him with unease. Was he leading them into glory or ruin? Was his dominance a shield, or was it a magnet for disaster? The Apalachin humiliation had proven one thing. The world was watching now. The FBI had turned its gaze toward the Mafia, and once that gaze fixed itself, it rarely let go. Vito had drawn the spotlight, and though he stood proudly in it, others wondered if the light would eventually burn them all. But Vito did not flinch. In his eyes, power was simple. You held it, or you didn't. And in 1958, no one in America held it like he did. He was the boss of bosses, the man at the top of the pyramid, the ruler of an empire built on narcotics, fear, and blood. Yet, as history would prove, crowns in the underworld cut deeper than they shine. And as Vito basked in his moment of triumph, cracks were already forming beneath his throne. Men he trusted were whispering in corners. Law enforcement was digging deeper. Rivals were sharpening knives. The higher he climbed, the further he had to fall. And though he could not see it yet, the fall had already begun. Chapter 21, The Narcotics Sting. The night was heavy with silence when the trap finally closed. In a quiet hotel room, away from the bright lights of Manhattan, deals were being whispered that would echo across the underworld. Cigarette smoke hung in the air like a veil, cheap liquor burned in glasses, and men who thought they were untouchable leaned forward, voices hushed but confident. What none of them knew was that every word, every promise, every gesture of agreement was being funneled directly into the waiting hands of federal agents. The walls, though still, had ears. The sting that would shatter the empire of Vito Genovese had begun. For years, Vito had moved like a ghost through law enforcement's reach. Charges slipped off him like rain off a coat. Witnesses vanished or forgot, evidence disappeared, and juries suddenly found themselves unconvinced. But in 1959, the government changed its tactics. They would not wait for Vito to stumble. They would build the stumble for him. With a patience equal to his cunning, federal agents constructed a net that would catch not just his soldiers, not just his dealers, but the boss himself. The target was his pride, the narcotics pipeline. For Vito, heroin was not just a business. It was the cornerstone of his empire. Gambling, loan sharking, extortion, they all paled next to the steady river of profit flowing from the white powder. It was global, it was modern, and it was unstoppable. But that arrogance, that belief in its invincibility, became his weakness. The sting began with whispers. Men Vito trusted were approached, pressed, and in some cases flipped. They were promised protection, lighter sentences, or simply reminded of what federal prison looked like when the doors slammed shut. Slowly, the agents wormed their way into the supply chain. They mapped routes from Italian ports to American streets, traced cash flowing through couriers, and planted informants where Vito least expected them. It was like watching termites eat through the beams of a mansion, quiet, invisible, until one day the whole structure gave way. Inside the Mafia, there were already cracks. Some resented Vito's brutal style. Others feared his ambition had drawn too much attention. A few saw in the government's pressure a way to settle old scores. Betrayal, in the Mafia, was like a cancer. It never started in the open, but once it spread, nothing could contain it. And in 1959, betrayal reached Vito's doorstep. The night of the deal, the room pulsed with tension. Bundles of heroin, wrapped tight and disguised, lay waiting to be moved. Men talked numbers, percentages, the quiet mathematics of crime. But outside, cars idled, agents crouched, and orders were whispered through radios. When the doors burst open, it was like a storm tearing through calm seas. Shouts filled the air, guns drawn, men shoved to the ground. In that instant, the myth of untouchability cracked. Vito was charged directly, named not as a distant boss, but as a central player. The indictment was a dagger aimed at his heart. For the first time, law enforcement wasn't satisfied with taking down his soldiers or cutting off a branch of his operation. They wanted the trunk. They wanted him, and they were willing to stake their reputations on making it stick. When news broke, the underworld trembled. Newspapers splashed his name across front pages, painting him as the king of a billion-dollar drug empire. Senators raged, the public recoiled, and rivals whispered with barely hidden satisfaction. For years, Vito had worn fear like armor, but now, that armor began to dent. Questions spread among his men. Could the boss really beat this? Or was the invincible Don finally within reach? Vito, true to form, denied everything. He carried himself with the same cold confidence that had carried him through exile, trials, and betrayals. In courtrooms, he sat upright, his eyes hard, his jaw set, as though daring the government to prove their case. His lawyers argued entrapment, insisted he was the victim of lies, that his enemies had set him up. But the evidence was heavy, and for once, the government seemed prepared. They had witnesses, recordings, surveillance. They had a story that connected Vito not just to whispers in the shadows, but to heroin on the streets. Yet beneath that confidence, cracks showed. Friends began to keep their distance. Allies who once stood shoulder to shoulder now looked for safer ground. In the world of organized crime, loyalty was a currency that only flowed when the future looked secure. And with Vito staring down decades in prison, that currency dried up fast. The trial was a spectacle. Prosecutors painted him as the mastermind of a poison pipeline stretching from Naples to New York. Jurors were told of ships carrying hidden cargo, of couriers slipping across borders, of addicts hooked on powder that flowed from his empire. They did not just present him as a criminal. They presented him as a villain, a man profiting off the destruction of communities, a shadow emperor who traded in misery. And while the Mafia had long preferred to keep its dealings invisible, here was Vito, dragged into the light, his empire dissected for the world to see. The verdict was a thunderclap. Guilty. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison. For the first time, Vito Genovese, the boss of bosses, the man who had risen above Costello, who had commanded respect through fear, was led away in handcuffs. The image of him walking into prison was more than a personal defeat. It was a symbol. It showed that even the most powerful mobster could be caged. But inside the underworld, the story was not so simple. Power never vanishes overnight. Even behind bars, Vito still carried weight. Messages slipped through, decisions made in whispers carried out on streets. His lieutenants continued to work in his name, and his legend still cast a long shadow. Yet, the sting had marked the beginning of the unraveling. The empire was bleeding, and rivals were circling. There was irony in it. For decades, Vito had believed himself untouchable, a fortress built on blood and fear. Yet it was not bullets or betrayal that struck him down, but the quiet persistence of law enforcement. A sting operation, patient, deliberate, invisible, had succeeded where rivals had failed. The mighty boss of bosses was brought low not by war in the streets, but by paperwork, surveillance, and a courtroom verdict. And still, even as prison walls closed around him, Vito did not bow. He plotted, he whispered, he waited. In his mind, the story was not over. Power, he believed, could reach past walls, past bars, past judgments. For men like him, prison was not an end, but another battlefield. But the truth was harsher. The empire he had built, the narcotics machine that had made him the most feared man in America, was cracking apart. Trust was dissolving, money was drying up, and the next generation of mobsters was no longer content to wait in his shadow. Behind those prison gates, time was working against him. The sting had struck more than his business. It had struck his myth. And in the Mafia, myth was everything. Once men stopped believing you were invincible, they started believing you could be replaced. Vito knew it. And as he sat in his cell, the echoes of his enemies' laughter reaching him even through concrete walls, he must have wondered, had the crown of bosses been worth the wait? For now, he clung to his defiance. He told anyone who would listen that he would beat the sentence, that appeals would overturn it, that he would walk free and reclaim his throne. But whispers in the streets told a different story. His enemies had tasted vulnerability, and they would not forget it. The sting had done what bullets could not. It had pierced the armor of Don Vito Genovese. And yet, in the shadows of prison, a new game was beginning. Because power, once seized, is never surrendered willingly. And Vito, even caged, was not finished. Not yet. The question now was simple, but deadly. Could a boss of bosses truly rule from behind bars? Or had the empire of Vito Genovese finally begun its slow, inevitable collapse? The answer would not come quietly. It would come with betrayal, with blood, and with the final unraveling of a man who once thought himself untouchable. Chapter 22, Conviction and Prison. The clang of the cell door was deafening, a metallic finality that echoed down the cold stone corridor. For a man who had once ruled over an empire that stretched from New York to Naples, this was the sound of a crown being stripped from his head. Vito Genovese, the self-proclaimed boss of bosses, had been sentenced to 15 years in Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. The king of the underworld was now just another prisoner in a gray uniform, his name reduced to a number, his empire suddenly distant, fragile, and slipping out of his grasp. The courtroom had been suffocating on the day of his conviction. The judge's words rolled out like hammers striking stone. 15 years. The number hung in the air heavier than the chandeliers above. For the jurors, it was justice. For law enforcement, it was triumph. For Vito, it was betrayal wrapped in ceremony. He had spent decades clawing his way up through blood and fear, and now, in the silence that followed, he could hear the weight of it all collapsing around him. When the gavel came down, a ripple of shock and satisfaction spread across the world of organized crime. Some of his rivals celebrated quietly, glasses raised in smoky backrooms. Others waited, watching closely, wondering if Vito could still wield power from behind bars. Because in the Mafia, prison was not always the end. Some men managed to run empires from a cell, their influence carried by loyal lieutenants who acted as their hands and voice. But Vito's position was different. He had declared himself the supreme boss, the unquestioned ruler. That kind of crown could not be worn in chains without showing cracks. The journey to Atlanta was humiliating. Shackled at the wrists and ankles, Vito was marched past reporters hungry for a photograph, a glimpse of the once untouchable Don reduced to a criminal in custody. Flashbulbs exploded, capturing forever the image of power humbled. For the public, it was a victory. For the Mafia, it was a dangerous wound, exposing just how far the government was willing to go. And for Vito himself, it was a betrayal he could not forgive. He had built an empire on the illusion of invincibility, and now, that illusion had been shattered in full view of the world. Atlanta Federal Penitentiary was no ordinary prison. It was a fortress designed to contain men who believed they could never be contained. Iron gates stood like teeth, watchtowers scanned every movement, and guards carried themselves with the authority of men who held keys not just to cells, but to fate. For Vito, walking through those gates was like stepping into another battlefield. He was no longer surrounded by loyal soldiers. Here, every man was his own wolf, and respect was earned not by titles carried on the outside, but by how one survived on the inside. Yet even in chains, Vito refused to show weakness. He carried himself with the same cold defiance he had shown in court. To the guards, he was quiet, calculating, a man who watched more than he spoke. To other inmates, he was both feared and resented. Some admired the legend, the man who had once stared down Frank Costello and won. Others saw him as just another fallen giant, a reminder that no man, no matter how powerful, was immune to the weight of law. Still, Vito was not a man who surrendered easily. Inside the prison walls, he sought to build networks the way he always had, through fear, respect, and calculated generosity. He smuggled influence the way others smuggled cigarettes, turning conversations in the yard into orders that could ripple back to New York. He carried himself like a man who still wore the crown, even if the throne had been taken from under him. But deep down, he must have felt the truth gnawing at him. A king without freedom is only half a king. What cut deeper than the sentence itself was the betrayal that had led to it. Informants, men he had trusted, had whispered his secrets into the ears of agents. The sting operation had been precise, almost surgical, peeling away his empire piece by piece until the net finally closed. Vito had always known betrayal was a risk in the Mafia, but this was different. This was betrayal fueled not just by rivals or weak soldiers, but by the relentless pressure of the government. And betrayal in prison felt heavier, because there was nowhere to run from it. He replayed the steps of his downfall over and over. The Apalachin fiasco, the attempt on Costello, the narcotics empire that had made him untouchable, and the sting that had ripped it apart. Each misstep was now a stone chained to his leg. He had wanted everything: control, respect, the title of boss of bosses. But in taking it all, he had made himself the brightest target, and the brighter the target, the easier it was to hit. Life inside the walls was a constant reminder of how far he had fallen. The man who once dined on fine Italian meals now stood in line for watery soup and bread that tasted like cardboard. The man who once had bodyguards clearing his path now shuffled past guards who barely glanced at him. The man who had commanded silence in rooms of killers now lay awake at night, listening to the endless hum of prison life. The shouts, the clangs, the footsteps echoing through concrete. Every sound was a reminder that he was no longer free, no longer feared in the same way. And yet, Vito clung to the belief that he could still rule. He wrote letters, smuggled messages, relied on lieutenants to keep his empire alive on the outside. Decisions were still made in his name. Deals still carried the weight of his reputation. But cracks spread quickly. Rivals sensed weakness. Allies questioned his reach. Younger bosses, hungry for power, began carving out their own paths, less interested in serving a man who might never walk free again. The empire Vito had built with iron fists and ruthless ambition was slipping like sand through his fingers. Prison changed men. Some became broken, shells of who they once were. Others hardened, turning the walls into armor. Vito became something in between. He refused to bow, but he could not ignore the erosion of his power. His dream of ruling unchallenged had been shattered the moment the judge declared his sentence. Now, he was forced to watch from behind bars as the world he had fought so viciously to control began reshaping itself without him. The irony was cruel. For decades, Vito had feared no bullet, no rival, no betrayal too large to survive. But in the end, it was a courtroom and a cell door that brought him down. His reign had not ended with a bloody shootout or a knife in the dark, but with the quiet grinding of bureaucracy and the relentless patience of the law. For a man who lived in a world where power was measured by fear, it was the most humiliating fate imaginable. And yet, he still waited. In his heart, Vito believed the story was not over. Appeals could be won. Allies could regroup. He told himself that prison was temporary, that his enemies would not dare move too boldly while he still breathed. But the world outside was changing faster than he could control. Law enforcement, emboldened by his conviction, pushed harder against the Mafia. Politicians demanded more action, and newspapers feasted on every headline about his downfall. In the cells of Atlanta, Vito could feel the weight of time pressing down on him. Every day behind bars was another crack in the image he had spent his life building. The boss of bosses had become just another prisoner, his name spoken not with fear, but with whispers of decline. The walls around him were not just physical, they were symbolic, a cage around the myth he had worked so hard to create. Still, he plotted, he waited, he dreamed of the day he might walk free. But deep down, he must have known that something had shifted forever. The empire he had built on blood and power was no longer his alone to command. Others were circling, waiting to claim the throne he could no longer sit on. The cell door closed each night with the same metallic echo, a reminder that dreams, no matter how grand, can be crushed under steel and stone. Vito Genovese, once the most feared man in America, now lay awake in a narrow bunk, the title of boss of bosses echoing in his mind like a crown too heavy to wear. And beyond those walls, the underworld moved on, sensing the end of an era. Rivals whispered. Allies drifted. The government pressed harder. The world was changing without him. The question was no longer if Vito could reclaim his throne, but whether the throne itself would even exist by the time he stepped out. And in that uncertainty, in that creeping doubt, lay the beginning of his true downfall. Chapter 23. The Prison Don. The guard slid the food tray through the slot, but Vito Genovese barely looked at it. His hunger was not for bread or watery soup. His hunger was for power, the kind that stretched past the thick stone walls and iron gates of Atlanta Federal Penitentiary. And somehow, incredibly, that hunger was still being fed. Behind bars, surrounded by fences and rifles, Vito was still giving orders that reached the streets of New York. It was as if his cell was less a cage and more a throne in exile. The whispers began almost immediately after his conviction. Could Vito really run an empire from behind bars? Was it possible for a man stripped of freedom to still dictate who lived, who died, and who got paid? In the world of the Mafia, the answer was a resounding yes. Prison had stopped many men, but not Vito. He was determined to show the underworld that his rule had not ended with a gavel and a sentence. If anything, he wanted his enemies to believe that prison had only hardened his grip. From the start, his methods were simple but devastatingly effective. Letters slipped through cracks in the system. Conversations in the yard were carried by trusted men who knew how to smuggle a message without leaving a trace. Lawyers became messengers, their briefcases carrying more than legal papers. Even guards, some swayed by envelopes of cash, played their part in turning Vito's cell into a command center. Each instruction that left Atlanta was a thread, and together those threads wove a web that stretched all the way back to the 5 boroughs. It was a dangerous balancing act. Vito knew his enemies were circling like wolves. The other families had not forgotten Apalachin. They had not forgotten how boldly he had declared himself the boss of bosses. With Vito in prison, they saw a chance to reclaim what they had lost. But Vito countered the same way he always had, with fear. Even from behind bars, the message was clear: defy him, and the consequences would be swift. Men disappeared, rivals were silenced, and money still flowed upward. Yet prison was not the same as the streets. Influence was harder to maintain. Loyalty was harder to guarantee. On the outside, Vito had always enforced obedience with his presence, his stare, his reputation, his calculated cruelty. Inside, he was reduced to words carried by others, and words could be twisted, softened, or ignored. Every order he gave had to travel miles, passing through hands that might be loyal or might be looking for their own angle. Trust became both his greatest weapon and his greatest weakness. Still, Vito adapted. He leaned heavily on a trusted circle of lieutenants who acted as his mouthpiece. They became his eyes and ears, feeding him news of street politics, keeping him connected to the empire he refused to abandon. It was a shadow government, run from a cell block, but to the men who lived and died under his orders, the shadow was still real. The streets whispered that Vito was not gone, that his hand was still guiding the game. And that whisper, more than anything else, kept his power alive. To the outside world, it seemed almost impossible. How could a man under constant watch still dictate the flow of drugs, money, and violence across New York? But organized crime thrived on the impossible. It thrived on bending rules, corrupting systems, turning walls into windows. Where most men saw barriers, Vito saw only challenges to be overcome. The prison walls could keep his body locked, but they could not cage his will. There was something almost medieval about it, like a king captured in war, but still feared by those outside the castle gates. Prison was supposed to break him, but Vito turned it into a stage. Every time a rival thought he was finished, an order slipped out of his cell to remind them he was still alive. Every time someone whispered about replacing him, a body would turn up as proof that he still had teeth. The myth of his power became as important as the power itself. In the Mafia, perception was everything, and Vito made sure that the perception of his rule remained unshaken. But beneath the surface, cracks were spreading. His lieutenants were growing ambitious. With Vito locked away, they saw opportunities for themselves. Some began building their own networks, carving out personal empires while still paying tribute to the old man in Atlanta. It was a dangerous game. Too much independence could look like betrayal, and betrayal under Vito was a death sentence. Yet too much loyalty meant sacrificing their own rise in a world where ambition was oxygen. The balance was fragile, and everyone knew it could shatter at any moment. Vito must have sensed this. He knew that fear alone could not hold men forever, not when greed whispered in their ears and opportunity knocked at their doors. He tried to hold on tighter, issuing orders that reminded his crew he was still watching. But the tighter he squeezed, the more the empire strained. Every letter, every message that left the prison was both a show of strength and a test of loyalty. And each one carried the risk of exposure. The authorities were not blind. They knew Vito was still pulling strings, and they watched carefully, waiting for him to slip. Inside the prison, Vito cultivated an aura of authority. He carried himself as if he were not a prisoner, but a ruler in temporary exile. In the cafeteria, he sat calmly, unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. In the yard, he moved with quiet confidence, flanked by men who sought his favor. Even other inmates recognized his presence. Some respected it, others resented it, but no one ignored it. Vito was still Vito, and in a world where survival depended on reputation, he refused to let his fade. At night, though, when the lights dimmed and the noise of the prison dulled, he must have felt the weight pressing in. The cell was narrow, the walls unyielding, the silence endless. For a man who once ruled the busiest streets of New York, these walls were suffocating. He would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the choices that had brought him here. He had wanted everything, and for a moment, he had it. But now, his empire lived only through whispers and shadows could not be trusted. The strain was beginning to show on the outside as well. The government had grown bolder since his conviction. Agents were emboldened by the belief that the Mafia was vulnerable, that the myth of invincibility was breaking. Newspapers ran stories mocking the Apalachin debacle and celebrating Vito's imprisonment. Politicians demanded more arrests, more convictions, more victories against the mob. The world outside was changing, and Vito could feel it slipping away with every passing day. Yet he clung to control with iron fists, even when those fists were shackled. Orders continued to reach the streets. Money still made its way back to his family. His name still carried weight in the underworld. For a time, it seemed as though he might defy the odds and remain the boss of bosses, even from behind bars. But prison has a way of corroding power. It strips away the immediacy, the presence, the ability to enforce threats with a glance or a word. Distance erodes fear, and without fear, power begins to crumble. The lieutenants grew bolder. The rivals grew louder. The government pressed harder. And through it all, Vito sat in his cell, orchestrating a symphony of crime with instruments that were slowly falling out of tune. He must have known the truth, though he would never admit it aloud. The longer he stayed behind bars, the more fragile his empire became. Yet still, he refused to let go. Even as cracks spread, even as whispers of betrayal grew louder, Vito clung to the belief that he could hold it together. He had built his empire through violence and fear, and he would not surrender it to time or circumstance. He would rule, even if his throne was nothing more than a bunk bed in a concrete cell. But as the years passed, the tension grew unbearable. Rivals outside the prison walls were sharpening their knives. Allies inside the organization were testing the limits of his reach. The government was circling, determined to expose the last threads of his control. And Vito, once the most feared man in America, now faced a new and terrifying uncertainty. How long could he keep ruling from the shadows? How long before the empire he had fought for, killed for, and bled for slipped entirely from his grasp? The cell door slammed shut again, the sound echoing down the corridor like a warning. For Vito, the fight was not over. But for the first time, he could feel the ground shifting beneath him, the weight of an empire straining against the chains of his confinement. And somewhere beyond those walls, men who once swore loyalty to him were beginning to wonder if the Don in prison was still the Don at all. Chapter 24, Decline of Power. The prison walls were supposed to keep him safe. That was the cruel irony. Vito Genovese had once thought that even in confinement, he could hold on to the empire he had built through blood, fear, and cunning. But the years crept forward like slow poison, corroding his influence piece by piece. Time is the one enemy no gangster can outwit, and time was working against him with merciless precision. On the outside, the underworld was shifting. Old men were fading, young blood was rising, and the rhythm of organized crime was changing to a tune Vito could no longer control. In the early years of his imprisonment, he could still direct the music, still conduct from behind the walls of Atlanta. But by the mid-1960s, the baton was slipping from his hand. Men who once trembled at his orders began listening to new voices. Rivals, once kept in check by fear, found room to maneuver. And among them was a figure whose patience, intelligence, and subtlety made him unlike the brash warlords of the past, Carlo Gambino. While Vito sat locked away, Gambino moved like a shadow, quiet but deliberate. He built alliances, cut deals, and positioned himself with the kind of strategic vision that Vito had once mastered. Where Vito ruled through raw intimidation, Gambino ruled through quiet persuasion. He didn't need to pound the table or raise his voice. His strength was in the way he made himself indispensable, the way he always seemed to be 3 steps ahead. He was a fox in a world of wolves, and the wolves never saw him coming until it was too late. This change in leadership style exposed the cracks in Vito's empire. For years, the Mafia had thrived on the myth of the boss of bosses, the man whose word was final. But with Vito locked in a cell, that myth weakened. His orders traveled slowly, filtered through lieutenants with their own ambitions. Messages were delayed, distorted, or ignored altogether. A command that once carried the weight of life and death now had to fight its way through layers of doubt and opportunism. Every delay chipped away at his aura. Every ignored order made him look weaker. And weakness, in the Mafia, was fatal. It was blood in the water. Men who once swore absolute loyalty began to hedge their bets. They paid lip service to Vito, sent him a portion of their earnings, and promised him respect. But in the shadows, they cut side deals, expanded their own power, and quietly shifted their allegiance to the new rising star. Gambino represented stability, profit, and a future. Vito represented the past, locked behind steel bars, slowly fading like an old photograph. Inside the prison, Vito sensed it. He wasn't blind to the whispers, the subtle shifts, the cooling of loyalty from men who had once kissed his hand. He tried to clamp down, to remind everyone that he was still the Don, still the man who had declared himself boss of bosses. But every attempt felt heavier, more forced. His letters carried urgency, even desperation. He doubled down on punishments, ordering hits to prove he could still enforce fear. But each killing carried diminishing returns. The message no longer echoed the way it once did. Rivals grew bolder, allies grew quieter, and for the first time in his reign, Vito felt the grip of time slipping across his knuckles. It wasn't just Gambino. Younger men across the families were rising. They spoke the language of the new underworld, one built less on public displays of violence and more on invisible networks of money, unions, and white-collar crime. They didn't crave headlines or dramatic shows of force. They craved efficiency, profit, and survival. To them, Vito's style, loud, aggressive, domineering, felt like an artifact from another era. He was the old general still fighting trench warfare in a world that had already moved to quiet boardroom battles. The underworld, like any empire, evolved, and those who failed to evolve were left behind. Vito had always been ruthless, cunning, and ambitious, but he had never been subtle. He thrived on spectacle, on being feared. Gambino thrived on the opposite. He made himself invisible, blending into the background, staying out of the newspapers, and building alliances that were ironclad precisely because they weren't held together by fear. Vito couldn't match that from a prison cell. No amount of intimidation could close the gap between him and a man who was free to shake hands, make deals, and sit at every important table. The FBI, too, played its part. The Apalachin debacle years earlier had forced law enforcement to finally admit what they had denied for decades, that the Mafia was real, organized, and national. Investigations grew sharper, surveillance more aggressive, and prosecutions more focused. Vito, once able to manipulate the system with bribed politicians and corrupt cops, now found himself on the losing side of a government determined to dismantle the myth of Mafia invincibility. The very spotlight he had tried to avoid now burned brightly, and it burned hottest on him. For a man like Vito, humiliation cut deeper than prison walls. He had dreamed of being remembered as the undisputed king of the American underworld. Instead, he was becoming a cautionary tale, a symbol of overreach. His rivals whispered that his time had passed. They mocked his absence, laughed at the image of the great Don reduced to sending scraps of orders through prison guards. For Vito, every whisper was a dagger. His pride, once as towering as his ambition, was being chipped away by the steady erosion of time and distance. Yet even as his empire weakened, he refused to admit defeat. To his men, he wrote with authority, insisting he still held the reins. To himself, he clung to the belief that fear alone could keep him relevant. He told himself that Gambino was only borrowing power, that the streets still remembered who had declared himself boss of bosses. But deep down, in the quiet hours of the night, he must have known the truth. Fear fades when the man behind it is caged. Respect fades when the man commanding it cannot stand in the room. The decline of power is rarely sudden. It is not a collapse, but a slow crumbling, stone by stone, until the once mighty fortress is nothing but ruins. That was Vito's empire in the 1960s. Outwardly, he still seemed strong, still gave orders, still collected tribute. But the foundation was cracking. Every rival who grew bolder, every ally who hesitated, every young gangster who looked to Gambino instead of him was another stone falling away. The underworld thrives on momentum, and Vito's momentum had shifted against him. Once, everything he touched seemed destined to expand his influence. Now, everything he touched seemed to shrink it. The men who had once feared his wrath now quietly placed their bets on the future. And the future did not include Vito Genovese. But Vito refused to go quietly. In his mind, he was still the Don, still the man who had clawed his way to the top against all odds. He believed he could hold on, even as the tide washed against him. Yet tides do not stop for men, no matter how ruthless. They rise, they fall, and they bury even the strongest under the weight of inevitability. In the quiet corridors of Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, Vito clung to power with the desperation of a man who knew he was losing it. He still dreamed of the day he would walk free, of the moment he would reclaim his throne and remind the world who he was. But the streets were no longer waiting for him. They had moved on, shifted, adapted. His enemies had grown stronger, his allies weaker, and the myth of his invincibility had cracked beyond repair. And so, the great boss of bosses sat in his cell, watching from afar as his empire slipped into the hands of younger, hungrier men. He could still see the shape of it, still feel the echo of his power, but it was like holding water in his hands. The harder he clenched, the more it escaped. The decline of Vito Genovese was not marked by one dramatic fall, but by 1,000 small cuts, each one deeper than the last. And as the years dragged forward, he faced the most haunting question of all. What happens to a king when his kingdom forgets him? Chapter 25. Illness and Isolation. The cell was silent except for the labored rhythm of his breath. Once it had been the sound of authority that filled rooms when he entered, the hush of voices, the pause of conversations, the subtle shift of posture from men who feared him. Now, in the dim confines of Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, it was the rasp of his lungs and the pounding of a weakened heart that marked his presence. The boss of bosses, the man who had once ruled the underworld with iron fists and unshakable ambition, was now reduced to a body betraying him, one painful beat at a time. It began as whispers in his chest, an occasional tightness after climbing the stairs or walking too quickly down the corridor. At first, he ignored it. Vito Genovese had spent his life pushing through pain, believing himself untouchable, almost immortal. But illness has no respect for fear. It cannot be bribed, threatened, or silenced. It creeps in slowly, then strikes without mercy. Heart disease tightened its grip on him, and for the first time in decades, he realized there was an enemy he could not bend to his will. The prison guards noticed before he admitted it. They saw him move slower, clutch the railing, stop to catch his breath when he thought no one was looking. Fellow inmates watched too, though none dared to say it aloud. The man who had once ordered deaths with a glance was now fighting to summon enough strength just to get out of bed some mornings. His body, once fueled by rage and sheer will, had begun to abandon him. The decline was steady, cruel, and humiliating. What haunted him most wasn't the pain itself, it was the erosion of image. Vito had spent a lifetime constructing the myth of invincibility, the shadow that loomed over every man in the streets of New York. His power had rested as much on perception as on force. But what happens when the myth cracks? When the men who once trembled hear that the Don can barely stand? Power, after all, is a fragile currency. And his stock was plummeting with every cough, every stumble, every day spent confined to a prison infirmary. Yet even in weakness, Vito fought to cling to control. He tried to keep his voice strong in letters, dictating orders, reminding his lieutenants that he was still the man at the top. He insisted he was recovering, that rumors of his decline were exaggerated. But no amount of bravado could mask the truth. He was physically broken. His heart disease was no rumor. It was a reality that cut deeper than any indictment or rival could. And the men outside the walls, younger and hungrier, knew it. They no longer feared the specter of his revenge. They calculated, maneuvered, and plotted without hesitation. Inside the prison, isolation grew heavier. His world shrank to the size of his cell and the walls of the infirmary. Visitors came less often. Letters arrived with less urgency. The underworld that had once revolved around him was now spinning without him, faster and faster, as if to remind him that time waits for no king. Every passing day, every sleepless night, hammered the same cruel truth into him. The empire he had built was slipping beyond reach, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The once feared Don now faced the humiliating reality of dependence. He relied on prison doctors, men he would have once considered beneath his notice, to check his pulse, monitor his failing heart, and prescribe pills that offered only temporary relief. He hated their touch, hated the way they looked at him not as a ruler or a monster, but as just another sick old man. In their eyes, he saw no fear, no reverence, only indifference. For Vito, that was the deepest cut of all. And yet, somewhere beneath the bitterness, there lingered something he had long buried: regret. Late at night, when the infirmary was still and the pain in his chest kept him awake, he thought of the life he had chosen. The bodies left behind, the betrayals, the endless wars for power. He wondered if it had been worth it, to climb so high, only to end alone, reduced to weakness, forgotten by men who once swore eternal loyalty. But regret is a dangerous companion for a man like Vito. He never let it stay too long. He smothered it with the same stubborn pride that had carried him through every fight, every betrayal. He told himself he had no choice, that this was the only life he could have lived. But still, the question's not. The Mafia is a machine, and machines do not stop for broken parts. As Vito's health declined, the machine moved on without him. New alliances formed, new leaders emerged, and decisions were made without his blessing. His name still carried weight, but it was fading like echoes in an empty hall. The future no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the men who could still walk free, still sit at tables, still shape the streets with their own hands. But Vito refused to surrender fully. In his mind, he was still the Don, still the man who had once forced America to acknowledge the power of the Mafia at Apalachin, still the man who had bent allies and enemies alike to his will. He held on to that belief, even as his body betrayed him. He believed that as long as he was alive, as long as his name was whispered in fear, there was still power, even if it was only an illusion. The truth, however, was undeniable. The once mighty lion was now caged, sick, and aging. His roar had become a rasp, his stride a shuffle. And in the underworld, where strength is survival, weakness is an invitation. Rivals watched, waiting. Allies drifted, plotting their own futures. And the empire he had fought for, killed for, bled for, was slipping through his fingers, grain by grain, as unstoppable as sand through an hourglass. By the late 1960s, Vito's illness was no longer a secret. Heart disease ravaged him, his health deteriorating with each passing year. Prison doctors treated him, but the inevitability of decline hung over every visit, every examination. The once feared boss of bosses was now sidelined, physically broken, and increasingly irrelevant to the world he had once dominated. And so he sat, day after day, trapped not only by prison walls but by the frailty of his own body. Once he had controlled men with fear, now he could barely control his own heartbeat. Once he had shaped the future of the underworld, now he was left to watch it slip away, powerless. But even as illness consumed him, there was one final question hanging in the air. The Mafia is never merciful. Would his enemies let him wither away quietly in his cell, or would someone, somewhere, decide to speed up the end of Don Vito Genovese? The heart of the boss of bosses was failing, but in the shadows of the underworld, hearts of rivals were beating strong, and they were waiting for the inevitable moment when the crown would finally, permanently, fall. Chapter 26: Death of a Don. The morning was gray, heavy with the kind of silence that hangs in the air before news spreads like wildfire. Behind the cold walls of the federal penitentiary in Missouri, the final chapter of Don Vito Genovese's story came to an unceremonious end. On Valentine's Day of 1969, the man once feared as the boss of bosses, the self-proclaimed king of America's underworld, took his last breath. There was no audience, no army of loyalists at his bedside, no dramatic farewell. Just a frail body, ravaged by heart disease, surrendering to a force even he could not bend. It's almost impossible to imagine. For decades, Vito had crafted his image as invincible, a shadow that loomed over New York's streets and dictated the balance of power in the Mafia. But death is the great equalizer. It doesn't bow to power, and it doesn't care about reputation. In those last moments, he wasn't the iron-fisted Don of the Genovese crime family. He was an old, broken man, far from the neighborhoods he once ruled, slipping into silence inside a prison cell. The guards who discovered him didn't see a legend. They saw paperwork, another name to record in the log of inmates who would never walk free again. For them, it was routine. For the underworld, it was seismic. Vito Genovese was gone. The man who had clawed his way through betrayal, exile, and federal stings had been defeated not by an assassin's bullet, but by his own failing heart. Word spread slowly at first, but when it reached the streets of New York, it carried a strange mix of reactions. Some men who had once feared him breathed easier, knowing the shadow of retribution had finally lifted. Rivals saw opportunity, a new opening in the endless chess game of power. And the younger generation of mobsters, many of whom had never felt the full force of Vito's wrath, regarded his passing with indifference. For them, the world had already moved on. His death was not the end of an era. It was simply confirmation of what had been true for years. Vito Genovese was no longer the man at the top. Still, there were others who could not help but feel the weight of it. The old-timers, the men who remembered his rise, his cunning, his iron grip, recognized that his passing was more than just another obituary in the criminal underworld. It was the extinguishing of a flame that had once burned so bright, it had threatened to consume everything in its path. Vito had wanted ultimate power, to rule the Mafia unchallenged. He had come closer than most. But in the end, he died powerless, confined, and forgotten by many who had once sworn allegiance. His funeral told the story better than words ever could. There were no grand displays, no massive gatherings of soldiers lining the streets. He was buried quietly in St. John's Cemetery in Queens, the same resting place for many Mafia bosses, but without the spectacle he would have once demanded. The crowd was thin, the loyalty watered down by years of absence and decline. To the world outside, it was just another burial. To those who understood, it was the final punctuation mark on a story defined by ruthless ambition and ultimate downfall. But what lingers most is the paradox of his life. Here was a man who had clawed his way to the summit of organized crime, who had held men's lives in his hands and shaped the course of the Mafia. Yet his death reflected none of that power. It was quiet, lonely, stripped of grandeur. A man who wanted to be remembered as untouchable left the world in the most ordinary way, his heart giving out in the confines of a cell. And still, his ghost lingered. In the months after his death, conversations in back rooms and smoky bars carried his name. Some said he had been betrayed, poisoned by rivals who wanted him silenced permanently. Others believed his death was natural, the inevitable consequence of years of rage and stress. In the underworld, truth and rumor are always intertwined, and for Vito, the lines blurred even in death. Was it fate? Was it conspiracy? Or was it simply the inescapable hand of time catching up to a man who believed himself immortal? The story of his death became a metaphor whispered through the Mafia's ranks. Power, no matter how absolute, is temporary. The throne that seems unshakable today can be reduced to dust tomorrow. Vito Genovese had once ruled as though he were invincible. Now he was gone, his empire fractured, his influence diluted. It was a warning to every man who dreamed of being boss of bosses. In the end, there is no escape from the inevitable fall. For those who had loved him, or at least respected him, there was a strange kind of mourning. They remembered the fire in his eyes, the iron in his voice, the way he commanded loyalty through sheer force of will. They remembered the victories, the ruthless decisions that had carved his path to the top. They remembered the man who made the world believe in the myth of the Mafia's invisible hand. But alongside those memories came the bitter truth. That myth had collapsed long before his body did. The man who had once shaken the foundations of the underworld now lay silent, his power buried with him. Yet, even in death, his presence cast a long shadow. His crime family still bore his name, the Genovese family, a reminder of his once immense reach. His rivals, too, carried scars from battles he had waged decades earlier. And his story, his rise, his fall, his death, became a cautionary tale for generations of mobsters who dreamed of seizing the same kind of power. It taught them that ambition without mercy may carry a man far, but it cannot carry him forever. And so the question lingers, did Vito Genovese die a failure, or did he achieve what no one else could? He had ruled as boss of bosses, his grip extending across states, his influence acknowledged by allies and feared by enemies. Yet he died in chains, powerless, discarded. Which mattered more, the peak he once reached or the prison cell where it all ended? The truth may lie somewhere in between. For a time, Vito Genovese embodied the dream of absolute power. He bent the world of organized crime to his will, reshaped it, and forced his enemies to bow. But that dream came with a price he could not escape. His final years stripped him of dignity, and his death sealed the reality that no man, no matter how ruthless, can outlive the machine he serves. On that gray February day in 1969, the underworld lost a giant, but it also learned a lesson it would never forget. Power fades, loyalty withers, and even the mightiest Don cannot conquer time. The boss of bosses was gone, and in his absence, the streets whispered with uncertainty. Who would rise next? Who would claim the throne left empty by the death of a man who once dared to rule them all? The world outside kept moving. Headlines reported his death, but only briefly. America had other battles, other crises, other names dominating the news. Vito Genovese's passing was not front-page history. It was a footnote. And maybe that was the cruelest fate of all, that a man who craved power and recognition more than anything left the world with barely a ripple. But in the quiet corners of the city he once ruled, in the whispers of old men at card tables and the memories of those who had lived under his shadow, his name remained heavy. His story was retold not with reverence, but with awe, a reminder of how high a man can climb, and how far he can fall. Death had taken Vito Genovese, but it had not erased his legend. His empire had fractured, but his name lived on, etched in the dark mythology of organized crime. His death was an ending, yes, but it was also a beginning. The beginning of a new era in the Mafia, one without him. And in that transition, one truth echoed louder than any other. Power may define a man's life, but it is power's absence that defines his legacy. The Don was dead, but the question remained. Would the machine he built ever truly let him go? Or would his shadow haunt the Mafia forever, reminding every man who sought the crown of what waits at the end? Chapter 27: Legacy of the Genovese Family. The cell door clanged shut behind him, but the echo did not end with his death. It carried forward, out of the prison, through the streets of New York, and into the bloodstream of the underworld itself. Vito Genovese may have died behind bars, but his name never left the streets. It is stamped, indelible, on the most powerful and secretive Mafia family in America. To this day, the Genovese family endures as a fortress of silence, a criminal empire that seems less like a collection of men and more like an institution carved into the very foundation of the city. It is one of history's ironies that the man who died powerless ended up giving his name to the family that would, for decades, be regarded as the most powerful of them all. He had wanted immortality through control, through sheer dominance. Instead, his immortality came through something stranger, his reputation fused to a machine that could outlive him. Even now, the Genovese name carries a shiver, a warning, a reminder of what happens when ambition becomes legacy. What makes the Genovese family unique is not just their power, but their silence. Where other Mafia families strutted, boasting through violence or flashy displays of wealth, the Genovese operated like ghosts. They built a culture of secrecy so absolute it became their shield. Detectives, prosecutors, journalists, all found themselves staring into shadows when they tried to map the family's true reach. The silence was by design, a philosophy that Vito had helped to enforce. If crime families were armies, then the Genovese were not shock troops. They were intelligence officers, quiet, deliberate, dangerous in ways you did not see until it was too late. Through the 1970s and 80s, when law enforcement cracked open the commission, when bosses were dragged into courtrooms and family hierarchies were paraded in headlines, the Genovese managed to remain less visible. Their leaders were rarely caught on tape, their soldiers less prone to carelessness. This was not luck, it was discipline. They adopted structures that blurred lines, layers of insulation that made it nearly impossible to link street-level crimes to the men pulling the strings. The family did not die with Vito. It became sharper, more cautious, as if absorbing the lessons of his downfall. This resilience turned the Genovese family into something closer to a corporation than a loose band of mobsters. Their fingerprints could be found on everything from labor unions to construction projects, from gambling rackets to loan sharking schemes. They had hands in politics, influence in real estate, leverage in industries so varied it was hard to know where the mob ended and the legitimate world began. To ordinary citizens, it was invisible. To insiders, it was proof that the family had become the very thing Vito dreamed of, untouchable. But power comes at a cost, even for an organization. The very silence that protected them also fueled their mythology. Rumors filled the gaps that facts could not, making them seem larger, darker, and more omnipresent than they may have actually been. For the men inside, this was both a blessing and a curse. To wear the Genovese name was to carry a certain respect, a kind of badge that frightened rivals and awed associates. But it also meant constant suspicion, constant pressure, constant fear that the ghosts of the past, Vito's shadow most of all, still demanded blood to keep the machine alive. The irony is that the family never wanted the spotlight. They cultivated invisibility like a religion. While other families fell to FBI tapes or dramatic betrayals, the Genovese thrived by discouraging flash, by rewarding loyalty, by punishing recklessness. It was as though they were building a monument not to Vito the man, but to the cold, unfeeling logic of his vision. Control, order, discipline. These were the true heirs of his empire. Still, beneath that order, men remained human. Ambition simmered, pride festered, and betrayal lurked like a disease. The family endured because it learned to absorb these flaws without crumbling. Bosses were replaced quietly, sometimes by committees rather than individuals, so that the fall of one man did not topple the structure. No single figure stood so tall that his absence could destroy them. That, too, was part of Vito's lasting legacy. He had seen what happened when one man reached too far, when power became too centralized. His empire fell with him. The family vowed not to repeat the mistake. And yet, even with all this, his ghost remained. The name, Genovese, was not erased, not hidden, not buried under another label. It endured as a reminder, both a mark of pride and a curse. Law enforcement invoked it as shorthand for organized crime's highest echelon. Rivals whispered it with a mixture of envy and dread. Even ordinary New Yorkers, decades removed from his reign, recognized the name as a symbol of Mafia power. Vito had failed in life to crown himself as undisputed king. In death, his name achieved the throne for him. The power of the Genovese family after Vito's death was measured not in blood spilled, but in the quiet influence they held. Union bosses who bent to their will. Politicians who owed them favors. Construction contracts that mysteriously went their way. They became the hidden hand behind the city's growth, invisible but undeniable. And the more invisible they became, the more dangerous they were. But with invisibility came paranoia. Who could be trusted? Who might flip to the FBI? Who might become the next informant, the next crack in the armor? The family's secrecy was its lifeblood, but it was also its prison. Men lived in constant fear that their words, their loyalties, even their families could betray them. To outsiders, the Genovese family was an empire. To insiders, it was a gilded cage where the price of survival was silence. This duality, the grandeur of their power and the suffocating nature of their existence, is the true legacy of Vito Genovese. He left behind not just a family that bore his name, but a culture that demanded discipline above all. A culture where ambition had to be tempered, where recklessness was punished swiftly, where power flowed like a river, broad, unstoppable, but always under control. And yet, history whispers its warnings. Empires fall. Legends fade. The Genovese family has endured for decades, yes, but cracks always appear. Informants talk. Investigations dig deeper. Generations change, and with them, values shift. What happens when silence is no longer enough? When the new world, with its technology, its surveillance, its relentless transparency, collides with the old ways of Omerta? That is the cliffhanger of their story. Even now, law enforcement continues to pursue them. Journalists continue to probe, and rivals continue to test their strength. The family remains, but the world around them has changed. Vito Genovese's name endures, etched into history, carried forward by a criminal dynasty that is both feared and admired. But the question lingers, sharp as a knife's edge. How long can any family, no matter how disciplined, defy the tide of time? Vito Genovese sought immortality. In a way, he found it. His body rests in the ground, but his name still walks the streets, whispered in shadows, invoked in headlines, stamped on a family that outlived him. The boss of bosses is gone. The Genovese family remains. But for how long?